June 22, 1835. In a small cabin in Weakley County, Tennessee, John and Elizabeth Baker held their newborn son, Cullen Montgomery Baker, not knowing that his temper would one day send frightened families to their doors and make his name a warning along the Texas and Arkansas line. The Baker place in Weakley County was a modest holding with rough log walls, a packed dirt floor, and fields that had to be fought for one stump at a time. John Baker worked long days behind a plow and with an axe, cutting back trees and brush so corn and small patches of cotton could take root. Elizabeth Baker kept the household going with little help besides her older children, cooking over an open hearth, washing clothes in cold water, tending a small garden, and keeping a strict eye on every child under her roof. Their life was plain, but they were not the poorest in the county, and John had enough pride in his land that he spoke of better years ahead. From his first years, Cullen did not bend easily to that hope. While other children on the farm and in nearby cabins learned that quick obedience meant fewer blows from a strap or switch, he tested every boundary. Elizabeth's word was law in the house, and she believed in discipline as much as she believed in the Bible she kept near the bed. Yet even when she whipped him, she often saw a stare that did not soften. When he was told to carry water, he dragged his feet. When he was ordered to watch smaller children, he wandered off. Chores were done late or poorly unless someone stood over him. Tennessee in those years never felt far from hardship. Weather ruined crops, sickness spread quickly, and small disputes between neighbors could grow into fistfights or worse. A boy growing up in that environment saw early that men who could strike hard and stand their ground often got their way faster than the men who argued or appealed to law. Cullen watched how some of the rougher men in the area spoke to others, how they used their size and reputation to win arguments before they started, and he paid attention in a way his parents did not fully see. When talk of Texas reached Weakley County, it sounded to John Baker like a chance to secure more land for his children. The stories that came back described wide spaces, cheap acres, and room for families willing to risk the move. John sold what he could not carry, loaded his family into wagons, and started the long trip southwest. For Elizabeth, the road meant dust, sick children, and long nights camped under the sky. For Cullen, still a boy but old enough to help, it meant restless days walking beside the wagon, watching unfamiliar country roll past, and feeling the pull of something larger than the farm they had left behind. The Bakers did not arrive in Texas all at once. They spent time working in Arkansas near places like Clarksville, where John hired out his labor to keep the family fed and to save enough to push farther on. Cullen saw different faces there, heard other accents, and watched strangers settle quarrels with fists or knives in backlots and alleys near small taverns. He was learning without being taught that a man's hands and his willingness to use them meant more than any sermon when tempers rose. By 1839, John Baker had managed to secure land in Cass County in northeast Texas, placing his family in the piney woods not far from the Red River. The country was a patchwork of cleared fields, thickets, and timber, with a few narrow roads tying scattered farms to small trading points. The nearest law was often a distant figure, and most men relied on themselves and their neighbors for protection. It was a place where a tough reputation could feel like a shield, and a bad one could spread quickly. The Baker cabin in Cass County stood near rough fields that all the family helped tend. Cullen was expected to take his share of the work, guiding mules, swinging a hoe, and fencing new ground. When John spoke, he obeyed more often than he had as a small boy. But his obedience rarely came with good temper. If a tool broke and someone laughed, he bristled. If a sibling made a joke at his expense, his reaction came fast with a shove or a clenched fist. He grew into a lean, wiry young man who moved with the ease of someone used to physical labor but who carried a constant undercurrent of defiance. Formal schooling never took firm hold in his life. Small subscription schools appeared from time to time when a teacher could be found, but they were short-lived, and they demanded that farm families give up the labor of older children for parts of the year. Cullen spent a little time in such makeshift classrooms, enough to pick up some basic reading and writing. But he never developed a taste for it. He found more satisfaction in the clear results of hunting, tracking game through woods he knew well, and returning with meat that the family could eat the same day. As he entered his teens, his world widened beyond the immediate line of Baker fields. Small settlements such as Cortland and Forest Home developed as purchase points for supplies and as places where men gathered to trade news, drink liquor, and gamble. On days when John sent him to handle errands, Cullen saw the bustle in these spots, the sound of voices in saloons, and the way men with guns on their belts were given space. It did not take long before he started lingering even when the chore that had brought him there was finished. The clothes he wore into these towns were often plain homespun, sewn by his mother and sisters, faded from use and patched where they had torn. A single suspender sometimes held his trousers in place, pegged or pinned when buckles failed. His boots bore the marks of fields and woods, not polished floors. There were boys and young men who laughed at the sight, but their laughter rarely lasted. Cullen watched them with an unblinking stare that made some look away before a word was spoken. When someone pushed the jokes further, he answered with his fists, moving quickly and without much warning. One early incident that people around Forest Home remembered involved a trip to a mill and store that drew customers from a wide area. Cullen arrived with grain in a sack and waited his turn while other boys who knew his family sized him up and made quiet remarks about his clothes and the way his hat sat crooked on his head. The jokes grew louder, and when one of them poked him in the side with a stick, he reacted. He stepped toward the closest mocker and drove him down into the dirt with a series of punches that landed before the boy could cover his face. Adults had to step in to pull him back. The message he sent that day followed him. As he grew older, he tasted liquor more often. Saloons in places like Forest Home were simple rooms with plank bars, a few bottles behind them, and perhaps a card table or two. Whiskey came cheap enough that a young man with even a small amount of money could drink himself into a swaggering frame of mind before riding home. Cullen learned how quickly strong drink sharpened both his tongue and his anger. Once he had a few glasses in him, he talked louder, pushed harder in any dispute, and showed less patience with anyone who did not clear his path. He also began to carry weapons more regularly. A pistol on his hip was not uncommon in that country, but the way he used the sight of it was different from many others. Some men wore a gun as a tool, needed for protection on long rides or for putting down an animal. Cullen treated it as part of the pressure he could exert in an argument. When someone hesitated to back down, he unbuttoned his coat or shifted it aside so that the revolver was plainly visible. Words that had been bold a moment earlier often quieted when the metal came into view. His willingness to humiliate others showed itself clearly in an incident in Forest Home when he chose a target who posed no threat to him. A middle-aged man came into town on ordinary business, buying supplies and tending to his affairs. Cullen, who had been drinking, blocked his path in the street and started mocking him, calling attention to his age and manner. When the man tried to step around him, Cullen grabbed a long rod and chased him, striking his back and shoulders and driving him down the street in front of onlookers. The victim did not fight back. He simply tried to get away. On the wooden sidewalks and in doorways, townspeople watched and did nothing, each measuring the risk of stepping into the path of the blows. Events like that gave him a reputation that spread beyond any single fight. Parents warned their sons to avoid him in saloons and on crowded days in town. Men who might have argued in other circumstances chose silence when he walked into a conversation. He was not part of a formal gang, and he did not yet live entirely by crime, but he had already learned that fear was a tool he could carry as easily as a pistol. The recklessness that marked his days in Forest Home and other small towns nearly ended his life in a single violent moment. One evening, a dispute in the settlement drew several knots of young men into a broader confrontation. Tempers had built through insult and liquor until punches were thrown. Knives appeared and someone produced a tomahawk, a weapon that had likely sat unused on a wall or shelf before that night. Cullen waded into the chaos, picking a man to batter, hitting him until he dropped. In the confusion, he failed to see a different fighter closing on his flank. The heavy-set man who had just finished his own struggle rushed Cullen, striking him hard enough to stagger him. In the instant when Cullen lost balance, the man grabbed the tomahawk and brought it down on Cullen's head. The iron edge crashed into his skull and he fell straight to the ground. The fight moved on without him, other men still shouting and grappling while he lay motionless in the dirt. Blood pooled under his head, and for a time no one knew whether he was alive or dead. Friends finally dragged him from the street and carried him into a nearby house. A doctor was sent for, and under weak lamplight he examined the shattered scalp and bone. The wound was deep and dangerous. Infection was a constant threat in such injuries, and the tools for dealing with it were limited. Over the next days and weeks, Cullen drifted through fever, pain, and stretches when he barely knew where he was. The doctor did what he could to keep the wound clean, but the question of whether the young man would survive remained open far longer than anyone in his family liked. When he was well enough to be moved, he went back to the Baker cabin. Elizabeth watched over him, changed bandages, and tended to his needs with a seriousness that matched the severity of his condition. John spoke to him in plain, direct words when he was awake and able to listen. He reminded him that the road he had been walking in Forest Home and other towns had led straight to that sickbed, and that the next blow to his head might not leave him breathing. For a time, Cullen listened without the usual flash of anger in his eyes. Pain and weakness had done what scolding never had. Recovery was slow. The scar on his head remained sensitive, and heavy work was out of reach for a long period. As strength returned, he tested himself on smaller tasks around the farm. He guided plows again, though he tired quickly at first. He helped mend fences and tend animals. He went to town less frequently, and when he did, he kept his distance from the worst of the drinkers and brawlers. People who saw him during that stretch noticed a quieter manner. He still carried himself with the same physical confidence, but he spoke more softly, and he seemed less eager to push minor disagreements into full quarrels. In Cass County, where news traveled by horseback and word of mouth, this shift did not go unnoticed. Neighbors who had written him off as a hopeless troublemaker began to say that the head injury might have shocked some sense into him. Men who had once kept him at arm's length were more willing to work alongside him in fields or on shared projects. Where before he had been described mainly as a bully, people now pointed out that he was capable of steady effort when he chose to give it. Among those who observed this more restrained version of Cullen Baker was a young woman named Martha Jane Petty, often called Jane. She came from a nearby family that traded in some of the same settlements and attended some of the same gatherings. She had heard stories of his wildness and the brutal fights that had nearly ended his life. But she also saw the man struggling to prove he could work and keep his temper in check. When families met at church or on shared work days, she saw him handling tools rather than bottles, and speaking politely to elders rather than shouting over them. By the end of 1853, Cullen stood at a crossroads that neither he nor anyone around him could fully see. He had survived a wound that could have killed him, and for a stretch he had shown that he could rise before dawn, labor in the fields, and come home without starting brawls in town. His parents dared to hope that the worst of his reckless years might be behind him. Jane's family watched him with cautious interest, wondering if he was becoming a man who could hold a farm and a household together. Under the surface, the quick temper and taste for domination remained, waiting for the chance to show themselves again as his life moved toward marriage, heavier drink, and the first killing that would mark him as a murderer in Cass County. In January of 1854, Cullen Montgomery Baker stood in a small Cass County church beside Martha Jane Petty while a minister spoke the words that made them husband and wife. And for the first time in his life, he tried to imagine himself as a settled man who came home each night to the same hearth. The room was simple, with rough benches, plain walls, and a few panes of wavy glass that let in cold winter light. Family from both sides had gathered, riding in on tired horses or coming by wagon over muddy roads. John and Elizabeth Baker watched their son closely, searching his face for some sign that the responsibilities he was taking on meant more to him than another moment of attention. Hubbard and Nancy Petty looked at their daughter and hoped that the man she had chosen would prove more like his hard-working father than the temper that stories described. For a time after the wedding, the outward picture of their life looked acceptable to any neighbor. Cullen and Jane moved into a small cabin and set about trying to make a farm work, with corn rows, a few hogs rooting in pens, and tools leaned against the wall when the day's work ended. He rose early, hitched up animals, and walked behind a plow until his shoulders ached. She cooked, cleaned, and tended to small chores without complaint. On Sundays, when they could, they traveled to services, sitting on hard benches with other local families. In those first months, he made an effort to stay away from the saloons that had nearly cost him his life. When he rode into Forest Home or other small settlements for supplies, he kept the visit short, avoided deep drinking, and returned home before the sun faded. People who had known him as a restless brawler noticed the difference. They saw a scarred young man who now spoke of crops, fences, and hogs instead of card games and fights. Jane's parents, seeing him work long hours and come home to their daughter, allowed themselves to relax. The land around them did not become easier simply because he had married. Weather still ruined plantings. Pests still stripped fields. The constant labor needed to keep a cabin and farm going pressed on both of them. He felt it as repetition without relief, a daily series of tasks that did not offer the same rush as a loud night in town. When tools broke or animals breached a fence, he cursed, then fixed the problem. But in quiet moments, he measured the narrowness of the life he had agreed to. By mid-year, the strain showed. He started to ride into town more often, sometimes on errands that could have waited. When he finished selling produce or buying supplies, he let himself drift toward the familiar doorway of a saloon. Old companions welcomed him back, and glasses were set out. The first drink took the edge off his frustration. The second loosened his shoulders. By the third, his old manner returned, with jokes made at another man's expense and a tone that demanded an audience. Jane saw the signs as he stumbled in later, smelling of whiskey, his eyes bright with a forced cheer that did not match the responsibilities waiting in the cabin. When she spoke up, telling him that he needed to think of their future, he responded with curt answers and cold silence, then went to bed without further discussion. The next morning, he often threw himself into work as if effort in the fields could erase the previous evening. But the cycles of restraint and indulgence grew shorter. In August of 1854, his temper found a new target in a way that shocked people who had previously tried to excuse his rough behavior as the impatience of youth. Near a store in Forest Home, an orphan boy named Stallcup came within his reach. The boy was small, poorly dressed, and carried himself with the careful movements of someone used to avoiding trouble. For reasons no one later could describe as more than a sudden cruelty, Cullen seized a whip inside the store, stepped into the street, and began lashing the boy in front of a crowd. The first strike hit with a crack that turned heads up and down the street. Stallcup cried out and tried to pull away, but Cullen followed, swinging the whip again and again across his back and shoulders. The leather bit into cloth and skin. Spectators stood frozen, some staring from doorways, others halfway into the street with hands half raised, torn between the urge to intervene and the fear of becoming the next target. No insult had been offered. No fight was underway. A grown man was beating a child because he could. Only when the boy staggered and nearly fell did someone shout Cullen's name and tell him to stop. He gave a last lash, then lowered the whip as if nothing significant had happened. Stallcup, shaking and sobbing, retreated with the help of a few bystanders who dared to step close only after the violence paused. The marks on his body and the memory of that afternoon did not fade. Men who had long tolerated Cullen's drunken outbursts now talked quietly among themselves about where such unchecked brutality would lead if no one stood against it. Stallcup was persuaded to take a step that many in that hard country avoided. With encouragement and support, he went to the local authorities and swore out a complaint against the man who had whipped him. Papers were drawn, and a hearing was scheduled. Word spread from farm to farm that a case charging Cullen Baker with assault would be heard at the Cass County Courthouse. Some said the boy was brave. Others said he was signing his own death warrant. When the day came, the courthouse was crowded. The building was plain, built for practical work rather than show. But every bench and bit of wall space filled with men who had known Cullen, worked beside him, fought him, or watched him from a careful distance. He sat at a table, his face hard, dressed better than he usually was in town, but still carrying the same rigid tension in his shoulders. Stallcup sat nearby, pale but steady. Witnesses were called one by one. Some of them tried to soften what they had seen, speaking in general terms about a whipping that went too far. Others spoke more plainly. Among them was a farmer named Wesley Bailey, a man known in the county as steady and honest with no taste for exaggeration. When his name was called, he stepped up, raised his hand, and gave his account in a calm voice that cut through the restless noise in the room. Bailey told the assembled court that he had seen Cullen take up the whip and strike Stallcup repeatedly in the street, that the boy had not been fighting or threatening anyone, and that the beating continued until blood was drawn and cries for mercy were ignored. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish. He simply laid out the facts as he understood them, letting the picture of a full-grown man lashing a defenseless child hang in the air. For Cullen, sitting a few yards away, those words landed as a direct attack on the image he wanted to project. In his mind, he ruled by fear and force in the spaces where he chose to move. Hearing another man, one with local respect, describe him before a judge as a vicious bully stripped away that control in a setting that mattered. The law was now considering his actions, and the story had been told by a voice that people believed. The hearing ended without him being thrown straight into a cell for life. But the shock to his pride ran deeper than any official penalty that might eventually come. Charges still hung over him. More sessions would follow. Neighbors talked, repeating Bailey's testimony in their own kitchens and yards. Every retelling turned the whipping of Stallcup into an established fact with names and details attached. For a man who relied on terror and sudden violence, the idea of being pinned to one brutal act in the cold language of sworn statements could not be tolerated. In the weeks after the hearing, he returned to his farm and outward routine, but his behavior changed. Jane, who knew only a part of what had been said, saw that he was quieter but more tightly wound, his silence filled with something darker than simple worry about crops or money. He rode out more frequently alone, sometimes circling past Bailey's place without stopping, sometimes disappearing into the woods for hours with no explanation. On the evening of October 8, 1854, the tension broke. As daylight leaked away over the fields of Cass County, Wesley Bailey worked near his barn and lot, tending to the last chores of the day. His wife and children moved in and out of the house, finishing their own tasks. The sound of a single horse approached along the road, hooves crunching on dry ground. When the rider drew closer, Bailey and his family recognized the figure in the saddle. Cullen rode straight into the yard carrying a shotgun. He did not dismount. Instead, he announced in a loud voice that he had come to shoot Bailey. The family heard every word. Bailey saw the weapon and stepped behind a post in the lot fence, seeking what little cover the narrow timber could provide. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that this visit had been planned and that the purpose was deadly. From his saddle, Cullen taunted the man he had come to punish. He called out that he would not kill him outright, that he meant to shoot him in the leg so that he could watch him jump and suffer. The words twisted the threat into something even more cruel, an act designed not just to silence a witness but to mock him in front of the people he loved. Bailey, clutching the post, faced a choice between staying partially sheltered and defying the order, or stepping into the open and trusting that the man who had already shown himself ruthless would keep his word. Cullen then raised the stakes. He warned that if Bailey did not step away from the post, he would aim higher. With his family watching from the doorway and yard, Bailey left his thin cover and moved into view. He stood upright, unarmed, facing the man who held a loaded gun. In that moment, whatever hope anyone might have held that Cullen would back down or fire low had no real grounding in his past behavior. But people later remembered that Bailey had at least tried to give himself a chance by cooperating. The shotgun fired, the two barrels discharging almost as one. Pellets and shot tore into Bailey's lower body, smashing bone and ripping flesh. He collapsed on the ground, screaming in pain, his legs ruined. His wife and children rushed to him, some crying, some shouting for help. Within moments, blood spread under him, staining the dirt. The yard that had held ordinary family work only minutes before now held a man fighting for his life. As chaos unfolded around the wounded farmer, his son ran for a weapon, grabbed a gun from inside the house, and tried to bring it to bear on the attacker. By then, Cullen had already pulled his horse around. In his haste, he left behind a sack of meal he had brought with him, dropping it in the yard as he kicked the animal into motion. The younger Bailey stepped into the yard with the gun, but the distance between them grew with every stride of the horse. Shots, if any were fired, did not find their mark. Neighbors arrived as word of the shooting spread. They found Bailey pale and gasping, the lower half of his body shredded by the blast. There was little they could do beyond sending for a doctor and trying to keep him still and warm. Over the next days, he lingered, enduring pain that seldom eased. Infection and blood loss worked against him. Despite the best efforts available in that time and place, he died, leaving his family with a grave to dig and a yard forever linked in their minds to the site of his last hours. The killing of Wesley Bailey sent a clear message throughout Cass County. Cullen had ridden openly into a man's home place, announced his intent in front of witnesses, and carried it out. The sequence of events from the whipping of Stall Cup to the testimony at the courthouse, and then to the yard where Bailey fell, could be followed step by anyone willing to look at it. Men who had once shrugged at Cullen's outbursts as rough behavior now understood that he would take lethal revenge on anyone who crossed him. Law officers and local leaders moved to act. Warrants were issued. Posses gathered, made up of men who knew the creeks, ridges, and thickets that a fugitive might use. Bailey's son and a friend tracked the killer's trail as far as they could on foot, reading hoof marks and broken brush. But Cullen knew the country too. He understood how to slide off main roads, ford streams at shallow points, and stop at outlying cabins where fear or sympathy kept tongues still. Before any organized group could close on him, he slipped across the state line, heading toward areas of Arkansas where he had kin and familiar names. Rivers and rough country lay between him and the Cass County courthouse, and each mile made it harder for Texas authorities to reach him. In the eyes of the law there, he was now more than a drunk with a quick fist. He was an indicted killer who had executed a respected farmer in his own yard. For Jane, the change shattered the sense of stability she had been building. The man she had married in a small country church at the start of the year was now a fugitive. She found herself pulled between families, between Texas and Arkansas, between the hope that he might somehow turn back toward ordinary life and the evidence that he had chosen a different road. In the years that followed, her own health and stability would suffer because of the decisions he had made, and their young child would grow up without a reliable father in the house. By the time 1857 approached, the pattern was fixed. Cullen Montgomery Baker had moved from local bully to known murderer. He had shown that he would use a shotgun to answer testimony, that he would ride into a neighbor's yard and tear a man's body apart in front of his children for the crime of speaking honestly about what he had seen. With the Red River and state lines behind him, he carried that readiness for murder into new country, where kinship ties, local resentments, and the coming national conflict would give him more chances to turn personal anger into deadly violence. By 1857, Cullen Montgomery Baker was living under other people's roofs in Arkansas, a married man in name who spent more nights on the move than at his own hearth, carrying the weight of a killing in Texas and looking for shelter among kin who feared him almost as much as they pitied him. He crossed the state line and drifted toward Perry County, an area of hills, creeks, and scattered farms where his mother's relatives had settled. Among them was his uncle Thomas Young, a landowner with enough means to offer a bed, a meal, and a place to hide from Texas officers who might try to follow a trail north. The Young place stood near rough farmland and timber with outbuildings, livestock pens, and a narrow road that tied it to the nearest settlement. When Cullen arrived there, he did not come as a humble guest. He came as a man who expected blood ties to provide protection. Thomas Young knew what had happened in Cass County. Men traveling between Texas and Arkansas carried the story, repeating it over and over on porches and in yards. A farmer had been shot down in his own lot after speaking under oath. The killer's name had reached Arkansas long before Cullen rode up to the gate. Still, family loyalty ran deep. Young let him in, set him at the table, and gave him a place to sleep, hoping that time, distance, and discipline might quiet the trouble that had followed him. The routine in Perry County looked different from Cass County, but felt no easier. Days were filled with work, cutting wood, tending corn patches and small herds, repairing fences after storms, and riding to mills or trading points with wagons. Cullen could handle such labor. His body was used to it, and he took on tasks without complaint when it suited him. Yet there was always a restless energy in the way he moved, as if he treated every job as a temporary duty between more satisfying confrontations. Around neighbors, he behaved with a stiff politeness that never quite put people at ease. Men who met him near the Young place or in small gatherings saw a wiry figure with old scars and hard eyes. He said little about Texas, answering questions with short replies that made it clear the subject was unwelcome. When someone pressed, he changed topics or walked away. The silence around his past did not erase it. It simply left others to fill in the gaps with what they had already heard. His marriage to Martha Jane Petty was a fact on paper, but in daily life it was coming apart. She spent long stretches in Texas near her family while he wandered, hunted, and attached himself to relatives in Arkansas. Letters were rare and brief. When he did appear near the Petty home, he brought with him the same mixture of charm, sullen anger, and heavy drinking that had marked their time together in Cass County. He never truly settled into a single house for long enough to offer her the steady presence a wife needed. They had a young daughter, a small girl whose earliest memories would have been of her mother, grandparents, and a shifting collection of aunts and uncles rather than of her father. Cullen did not show patience with children. He had no interest in sitting at a table listening to childish talk or in comforting a crying infant. When he visited, he held the child briefly, then handed her back and drifted toward the door, drawn to the road, the woods, or a jug shared with men who cared more for cards and whiskey than for family obligations. Illness and strain worked on Jane as the years turned. Frontier life punished women who carried too much work and worry, and she carried both. She shouldered the burden of raising their daughter among the petties while watching rumors about her husband reach every corner of the community. Her body weakened under illnesses for which there were few remedies beyond rest, herbs, and prayer. Cullen rarely stayed long enough to help when sickness swept through the house. When he did appear, he brought tension rather than comfort, a reminder that the man who should have been her defender had made himself a hunted figure. In time, Jane died, leaving their little girl without a mother's care. The specific hour and cause were not noted in official lines, but the effect on the household was plain. The Pettys grieved for a daughter who had pinned her hopes on a man who never gave her an easy year. Neighbors understood that the child now depended on grandparents and other relatives for everything. Cullen did not step in to fill the gap. He was absent when she was buried, absent when the child asked for answers, absent when the family rearranged itself around an empty place at the table. After Jane's death, he left the child with the Pettys and returned to Arkansas for longer stretches. In Perry County, he resumed his pattern of moving between the young place and nearby holdings, taking work when he needed money or supplies and spending free hours in rough company. He frequented country gatherings where men traded horses, bought liquor from informal sellers, and tested one another through boasts, wrestling matches, and quarrels. At such events, his willingness to escalate set him apart from men who knew when to stop. One day, a dispute over horses dragged him into a killing that marked his name in Arkansas records as clearly as Bailey's shooting had done in Texas. The argument centered on a man surnamed Wortham, who crossed paths with Cullen at or near the young place. Horses were valuable, and accusations of theft or misuse could explode quickly. Words were exchanged, voices rose. Where another man might have broken off the quarrel or agreed to let older heads settle it, Cullen reached for his knife. Witnesses later told officers that the clash happened fast. The two men closed distance, and Cullen drove the blade into Wortham with focused force. The first strike cut deep enough to stagger him. Instead of stopping, Cullen pressed the attack, stabbing again until the man fell. Blood stained the ground. Whatever life remained in the victim ebbed out while those nearby either shouted in shock or stood frozen. Yet again, there had been no drawn-out feud, no equal contest. A flare of anger over property had ended with a body on the earth. Law in Perry County could not ignore a corpse left by a blade. Local officers took statements, traced the path of the quarrel, and presented what they had to a grand jury. Indictment followed. A formal charge for killing Wortham now joined the unresolved case in Texas. Cullen's name appeared on lists in both states. The circle in which he could move without risk of capture narrowed, even as he tried to widen it with speed and nerve. Relatives felt the strain. Thomas Young now housed not only a man wanted elsewhere, but also a man under suspicion within his own county. Visits from law officers put a chill over the farm. Neighbors looked at the Young household with growing unease, wondering how long it would be before a posse came with chains instead of questions. Some pleaded with Cullen directly, telling him that every new act of violence made it harder for them to protect him. Instead of accepting their warnings, he took them as insults. He heard every word about worry and law as an attack on his pride. In conversations on porches and at fence lines, he answered concern with cold smiles or dark stares. If anyone urged him to submit to officers and stand trial, he brushed it aside, confident that he could outmaneuver sheriffs and marshals as he had done before. Underneath that confidence lay a clear pattern. He had no intention of placing his fate in a courtroom. He returned more often to Texas soil, slipping back across the line to the petty neighborhood and to other families along the Red River. In those visits, he sought women, liquor, and the sense of power he drew from riding into yards unannounced. His young daughter remained with her maternal grandparents. If he saw her at all, the meetings were brief and did not change her daily life. She grew up knowing his name more as a shadow than as a comforting presence. During this period, he became acquainted with another woman who would tie her life to his and pay dearly for it. Martha Foster. She belonged to a family that lived near the Texas and Arkansas border, connected by marriage and neighbor ties to households he already knew. She saw the same scarred, intense man that had once impressed Jane, a figure who could handle a horse, shoot accurately, and talk boldly about dangers other men avoided. In a region where physical toughness still counted for much, those qualities attracted attention. Courtship with Cullen did not follow the gentle pattern some couples knew. He did not bring a steady string of small gifts or speak in soft phrases under trees after church. Instead, he appeared and disappeared, arriving with stories of fights and narrow escapes, then vanishing for weeks. Some in the Foster circle distrusted him and said so. Others, worn by hardship and impressed by anyone who could survive it, saw courage where caution would have seen menace. In time, Martha agreed to marry him. The union joined another woman's future to a man with a record of deserting home when trouble thickened. A ceremony took place, simple and solemn, under the eyes of kin who knew his reputation but hoped that having a household of his own anchored in the Foster network might finally steer him into quieter channels. For a brief stretch, he worked near her kin along the Sulphur River country, helping with ferries, farming, and odd jobs that came with living near a crossing used by travelers and traders. The pattern of his behavior did not truly change. On days when work demanded his full effort, he could drive himself hard, moving freight across the water, handling teams, or chopping trees along the banks. On evenings when a jug circulated or when he rode into a nearby settlement, he courted confrontation instead of peace. Staring contests at card tables, sharp words over imagined slights, and a quick hand to a pistol or knife kept his standing as a man to be feared. Behind closed doors, his irritability and self-centeredness made life with him a constant strain for any wife, no matter how patient. Martha came to understand what Jane had lived through, though their circumstances differed. Each time he drank heavily, the risk rose that he would shove, curse, or strike. He had no interest in being questioned or corrected. When she asked where he had been after a long absence, he responded with anger rather than explanation. When she showed concern that officers might appear, he mocked her fear. Her family, seeing the tension, sometimes tried to intervene, but their influence had limits. Meanwhile, legal pressure continued to build. Texas authorities still wanted him for the killing of a Cass County farmer, and Arkansas officials had not forgotten Wortham's death. Attempts at extradition crossed state lines, letters moved between county seats, and names like Baker and Young appeared in records that described arrests attempted and arrests missed. Each time an officer rode out to follow a rumor and found nothing, the man on the other side of the search grew bolder in his belief that he could not be caught. Outside his personal circle, the wider country was changing quickly. Debates over slavery, states' rights, and the future of the Union moved from newspapers and speeches into everyday talk in stores, churches, and fields. In Texas and Arkansas, many white households supported secession. Evening conversations that once centered on crops or local quarrels now turned to the possibility of war. Young men compared their readiness to serve, measured themselves against famous fighters, and imagined the glory of military life. For someone like Cullen, who already saw himself as a fighter, the talk of regiments and campaigns offered a new stage. Joining mounted units promised steady pay, a sanctioned outlet for aggression, and a chance to be praised for the same qualities that had made him dangerous in civilian life. He did not care about political theory or constitutional arguments. The appeal rested in uniforms, weapons, and the prospect of riding in organized companies rather than as an isolated outlaw. As 1861 approached, enlistment officers and local leaders formed companies of volunteers, drawing men from farms, towns, and river crossings. Recruitment speeches emphasized honor, duty, and the defense of home states. The same communities that had whispered about Cullen's violence now saw in him someone who could handle a horse, fight aggressively, and intimidate opponents. In that context, the very traits that had horrified neighbors in quieter years began to look like assets rather than liabilities. He responded to the new opportunity by aligning himself with Confederate cavalry elements, slipping from the role of private criminal into that of a soldier in gray. Men who rode with him during this early military phase would later remember his fearlessness under fire and his refusal to follow orders that did not suit him. The discipline of an army could harness his aggression for a time, but it could not remake his character. Beneath the uniform and the banner, the same man remained, one who had abandoned his first wife and child, stabbed a man over horses, and treated every rebuke as an excuse for violence. By the time the first major campaigns of the war unfolded, Cullen Montgomery Baker had transformed his life once again, shifting from a fugitive hiding among relatives to a mounted fighter carrying official authority. Behind him lay the forgotten grave of a woman who had carried his name, a daughter growing up without him in Cass County, and families in 2 states who viewed his visits as the arrival of trouble. Ahead lay a period in which the chaos of war would give him wider license to act on his cruelty, turning personal brutality into part of the larger violence that swept Texas and Arkansas. On February 22, 1862, muster officers at Linden recorded the name Cullen Montgomery Baker on the roll of Company 1 of the 15th Texas Cavalry. The men around him were farmers, store clerks, and boys who had never been far from their home counties. They arrived with horses in mismatched tack, personal rifles or shotguns, and a belief that military service would give structure to the chaos that the war had already brought to Texas. Baker stood among them as a man who had already killed more than once, carrying that experience into a regiment that still treated killing as something theoretical. Training grounds near Clarksville turned those loosely organized volunteers into a mounted regiment on paper. But life in camp remained rough and improvised. Drills sent lines of horsemen across open fields, dust rising under hooves as officers shouted commands. The men slept in tents or crude shelters, cooking their own food over shared fires. Discipline relied as much on peer pressure as on formal punishment. In that environment, Baker's short temper and taste for confrontation fit easily. He drank heavily when supplies allowed, picked fights without hesitation, and answered any perceived insult with his fists or the butt of a pistol. Fellow soldiers learned quickly that long looks or careless jokes around him could trigger sudden violence. Records show his name on the muster rolls through the late summer of 1862, with notations that place him near the Arkansas River, ill and away from the main body of the regiment. Disease hit Confederate camps relentlessly. Men weakened by bad food, contaminated water, and exposure filled crude hospitals or lay on blankets under trees waiting for fevers to break. When captains tallied their men, desertions and deaths pulled numbers down month after month. In that turbulent setting, a man could slip away with relative ease. For Baker, official entries mention sickness and then mark him as a deserter in early 1863. Whatever the exact route, his formal service in the regular Confederate cavalry ended while the larger war pushed deeper into bloodshed. During that same year, his earlier enlistment in Company G of Morgan's regimental cavalry in Jefferson remained part of his trail, another brief period of uniformed service that had not held him. Together, those entries in Confederate records show a pattern. He joined, drew pay, and then left when orders and discipline closed in around him. He had no interest in the long marches, chain of command, and strict obedience that defined sustained regimental duty. Once sickness and the confusion of field assignments created an opening, he moved out of sight of official officers and into a different kind of war. By 1864, Baker surfaced again in Arkansas, attached not to a conventional regiment but to a guerrilla-style formation known as the Independent Rangers. That group operated under the loose umbrella of the Confederate Home Guard. On paper, such units existed to track down deserters, guard local communities, and support Confederate authority in areas far from major battle lines. In practice, the Independent Rangers that Baker joined used that cover to carry out violent raids on civilians. The borders between military service, criminal behavior, and personal revenge blurred until they disappeared. Baker's past fit that reality exactly. The Independent Rangers rode through Perry County and neighboring counties in Arkansas, moving along wooded roads, across small farms, and through isolated settlements. Younger men had gone east with formal regiments, leaving elderly fathers, women, and children to handle crops and livestock. That absence turned those households into easy targets. Under Baker's influence, Rangers arrived at houses claiming to look for deserters or suspected Union supporters. They demanded food, horses, weapons, and information, backed by cocked pistols and leveled carbines. Any hesitation or complaint brought immediate beatings. Women endured threats and assaults that went unpunished. Children watched men in Confederate hats drag their fathers into yards, whip them, or hold them at gunpoint. The men who rode away after each visit left behind families who understood that official structures offered no protection. Another group, the Mountain Boomers, claimed Union loyalty and operated as a separate guerrilla band in the same region. They ambushed Confederate partisans, guided Union patrols, and harassed pro-Confederate households. The Independent Rangers regarded them as direct rivals. Skirmishes between the two groups turned forested slopes, hollows, and creek crossings into small battlefields. Shots rang out from behind trees and rocks whenever one side picked up the trail of the other. In several encounters, Rangers under Baker's leadership killed identified members of the Mountain Boomers, stripping the bodies of weapons and supplies and leaving the dead as warnings. By the end of that year, accounts from the area described the Independent Rangers as the dominant armed band, their control maintained through a mixture of political intimidation and outright banditry. The Saline River and the Ouachita Mountains formed a natural barrier that many Arkansas families had to cross if they wanted to leave the state. By late 1864, some residents of Perry County decided that they could not live any longer under the constant fear created by people like Baker and the Rangers. Older men, women, and children loaded household goods into wagons, gathered livestock, and set out along a route that would take them over the Saline River toward what they hoped would be safer lands farther west. They left behind homesteads that had been in families for years, putting distance between themselves and the violence that now defined their county. Word of that wagon train reached the Independent Rangers. To Baker, their departure represented more than a handful of families seeking safety. He treated it as a direct challenge to Confederate allegiance and to the authority that he and his men had carved out through fear. He led his Rangers along forest tracks and river trails until they reached the Saline crossing where the emigrant party had begun to ford. Steep wooded banks framed the river. The current moved steadily through the valley, cold and dark beneath overhanging branches. Wagons rolled onto a gravel bar, wheels grinding over stone as teams strained against harness. Families urged children to keep close while they guided livestock into the shallows. Baker and the Independent Rangers waited until the settlers had nearly completed their crossing. When the last wagons reached the far bank, the Rangers signaled for the group to halt. Armed men rode into view on the Arkansas side, rifles across saddles, cartridge belts visible over their clothing. Baker called across the water and ordered the emigrants to return, declaring that their departure marked them as disloyal to the Confederate cause. The leader of the settlers, an older man who had organized the move out of Perry County, refused to bring his people back. After years of hardship, he had chosen flight instead of submission to men like Baker, and he told the Rangers that the wagons would continue west. That answer triggered the first shot. Baker raised his pistol and fired at the man who had spoken for the emigrants. The bullet struck with lethal effect, and he fell in view of his family and neighbors. Panic broke out among the party on the far bank. Women grabbed children and pulled them behind wagons. Men ducked behind trees or ox teams, torn between returning fire and protecting their families. Across the river, the independent Rangers held the advantage. Their horses gave them height, and their weapons were ready. In the moments that followed, Baker changed his tone. He called out that there would be no further killing if the emigrants came back across the river and returned to the Arkansas side. He told them that their offense lay in attempting to leave and that compliance would bring an end to the violence. Faced with the sight of their fallen leader, many believed that they had no choice. The river that had symbolized escape a short time before now represented exposure to gunfire in the open channel. Under that pressure, the emigrant party began turning wagons and driving livestock back through the water toward Baker and the Rangers. As the wagons reached the original bank, the independent Rangers closed in. Men dismounted and positioned themselves where returning settlers had to pass. Baker had already killed the first resistor. Now, as the emigrant men came within range under the promise of safety, the Rangers opened fire at close distance. Shots tore into unarmed men who had surrendered their brief hope of escape. By the time the gunfire stopped, the dead lay among returned wagons and trampled ground. Contemporary accounts record that 10 men from Perry County lost their lives in the incident, the initial leader followed by 9 others who had trusted Baker's assurance. The episode entered local memory as the Massacre of Saline. The women and children who survived the Saline River murders stood in a landscape marked by fresh bodies and overturned belongings. With husbands, fathers, and brothers lying dead, they faced an impossible future. The independent Rangers stripped wagons of valuables, took horses and mules, and asserted full control over the scene. In that moment, Baker's authority rested not on any written commission from Confederate officials, but on the immediate display of lethal force against people who could not resist. The massacre made clear that he used the language and symbols of Confederate loyalty as tools to justify robbery and killing, not as principles that restrained him. News of the Saline River murders spread through Perry County and beyond. Families heard of the emigrants who had tried to leave and had instead been gunned down after returning under a promise of safety. The story reached scattered cabins, small churches, and crossroads stores. Some residents began to think of leaving quietly in smaller groups, avoiding main crossings where Rangers might wait. Others stayed, convinced that moving would draw Baker's attention. In either case, the name Cullen Montgomery Baker carried a new weight. It meant more than a drunken brawler or a quarrelsome neighbor. It meant organized, deliberate killing under cover of the war. The Saline River massacre did not exhaust Baker's violence during the final year of the conflict. In the small town of Spanish Bluff in Bowie County, Texas, he found another opportunity to enforce his will with bullets. The town sat near the Red River, linked to Arkansas by trade routes and shared families. By late 1864, Union troops, many of them African-American soldiers, patrolled parts of Arkansas and approached the Texas border. Their presence challenged men like Baker, who had built reputations on the idea that no one could hold them accountable. One day, toward the end of that year, Baker entered a saloon in Spanish Bluff wearing a Confederate hat, armed as usual. The room contained local men gathered at tables, bottles on planks that served as a bar, and the noise of casual talk. Outside, 4 African-American Union soldiers approached the building. They served in federal uniform, part of the occupation forces that had advanced into the region. When they stepped into the saloon, they brought military authority, however limited, into a place where Baker had long acted without challenge. The soldiers crossed the room and confronted the man in the Confederate hat. They demanded identification, seeking to verify who he was and why he carried weapons inside. In that period, such checks formed part of their duty. Many former Confederates remained armed and hostile, and the Union command relied on patrols to assert control in contested areas. Baker heard their questions and recognized their status as both Union soldiers and black men in uniform, a combination that he refused to accept. He turned toward them with his pistol already in hand. Before the soldiers could react, he fired. Witness accounts and later summaries agree that he shot and killed the sergeant and the 3 enlisted men in a rapid series of shots at close distance. The saloon filled with smoke, splintered wood, and the sounds of men trying to move out of the line of fire. The 4 soldiers collapsed in the room where they had attempted to carry out a routine check. They died as victims of a man who refused any form of oversight, especially from armed black soldiers representing the government that now claimed authority over regions he considered his hunting ground. The Spanish Bluff killings reinforced Baker's growing reputation for killing from advantage. The soldiers had walked into a confined space, unprepared for an immediate attack from point-blank range. They had not drawn weapons or fired. Baker exploited that hesitation. When word of their deaths reached Union commands and local black communities, anger rose. The fact that the murderer remained at large, supported or at least sheltered by sympathetic residents, underscored the fragility of federal control in the border counties. Taken together, his time in Confederate cavalry and his leadership within the Independent Rangers created a clear pattern by the close of 1864. Official regimental records captured his enlistments, sickness, and desertion. Civilian testimonies and regional accounts recorded his shift into guerrilla warfare, rural intimidation, the Saline River massacre of unarmed settlers, and the Spanish Bluff saloon murders of 4 African-American Union soldiers. In those years, Cullen Montgomery Baker moved from a violent man with a record of personal killings to a figure whose name stood for organized massacres in Arkansas and Texas. Spring of 1865 settled over the Sulphur River bottoms, with a heavy stillness that hid how much had changed, and while armies in distant states stacked rifles and furloughed men, Cullen Montgomery Baker rode back into the border country and looked for a place where war's confusion could keep shielding his violence. The land where Texas and Arkansas met did not hold clear borders in the soil. Pine stands broke into open fields, then dropped into low ground thick with cane and underbrush along the river. The sulphur wound east and west, muddy and slow in some stretches, faster where fallen trees and sandbars narrowed the channel. Ferries served as crucial links between counties, carrying wagons, livestock, and riders from one bank to the other. Whoever controlled a crossing controlled the movement of people and goods, and in the unsettled months after Confederate collapse, those crossings became strongholds for men willing to enforce their own rules. One such crossing lay on the line that separated Texas from Arkansas, known simply as the Line Ferry. The boat was a flat, broad platform built to carry heavy loads, worked across the current by ropes and poles. Landings on either bank consisted of cut slopes and churned approaches where wheels had dug deep ruts and hooves had beaten the earth bare. There was no grand structure, only a rough shelter, a few sheds, and the constant noise of water against wood. In that ordinary setting, Cullen found exactly what he wanted, a place to collect tolls, track who passed, and make every traveler understand that the man at the crossing held the power of life and death. He attached himself to the operation around the line ferry and soon acted as if he owned it outright. Some accounts describe him as the operator, others as the dominant presence who directed whoever technically held the license. In practice, he lived on or near the Texas bank, kept weapons close to hand, and treated the ferry as a base. White families who approached with wagons, especially those he knew from earlier years, had to face his stare and pay whatever charge he set. Freed men and women newly released from bondage and trying to reach work, kin, or distant towns met something far worse. Black travelers arrived in the first months after Confederate surrender with hopes carved from rumor. Many had heard that wages were being offered for labor on plantations converted to free farms, that the Army or the Freedmen's Bureau would protect them if they could reach certain posts, that daughters and sons sold away years before might be traceable through new officials. To reach any of those possibilities, they needed to cross rivers and pass through territory where men like Baker had no intention of accepting emancipation. When groups of freed people came to the line ferry, they encountered a tall, lean man with a battered Confederate hat and guns that he carried as natural parts of his clothing. He demanded payment far above what white travelers paid. If a group pooled coins and offered what little they had, he mocked the amount and claimed that it fell short. Voices that tried to negotiate met harsh replies. If anyone spoke sharply, he called the words insolent and reached for his weapons. Several times he answered supposed disrespect by shooting men on the landing, leaving bodies where other travelers had to see them. In other instances, he forced black laborers to work the ferry and then beat them when they tired or hesitated. The bottomland around the crossing became a place that freed families learned to fear. Stories moved quickly among black communities along the river. People told each other that the line ferry had turned into a bar of death, that a man there shot travelers for speaking out of turn, and that no Army officer seemed close enough to stop it. Some groups chose longer routes upstream or downstream, adding days to their journeys in the hope of avoiding an encounter. Others had no choice. The ferry sat on the most direct path to fields where new work had been promised. In the house near the ferry lived Cullen's second wife, Martha Foster Baker. She came from the same network of families that had once seen him as a hard but capable man. Marriage had not softened him. She bore the daily strain of a husband whose mood swung between forced charm and sudden rage, whose nights out drinking led to shouted accusations when he returned, and whose hands turned rough whenever he felt crossed. She heard gunshots from the riverbank, tended to his clothes when they came back stained, and listened as he bragged that he was still the one man in the region no freedman or federal soldier could command. Neighbors later remembered one series of incidents that showed the way he treated her. He forced Martha into the saddle on cold, wet days when she was sick, driving her to ride beside him in rain and winter wind even when she begged to stay indoors. He pushed the horses hard, ignoring her condition. After such trips, she collapsed in bed with chills and fever. Instead of sympathy, she received curses for slowing him down. Repeated exposure weakened her already worn body. When illness finally took hold in a way she could not shake, he did little more than complain that she could not keep his house. Martha died in that period, leaving the ferry house quieter but more haunted. Her family buried her in the local soil and mourned a young woman who had tied her fate to a man with a history that everyone now recognized as ruinous. To them, she was a daughter, sister, and niece lost too early. To Cullen, she was closer to an object removed from his path than a partner gone from his side. His behavior after her death made that clear to anyone who came near the house. Not long after the burial, he dressed a dummy in her clothing. He took one of her dresses, stuffed it with straw or rags, fixed a head on the top, and placed the figure on the porch or in the yard where it could be seen from the road. Sometimes he propped it in a chair. Sometimes he moved it, changing its pose. From a distance, the form looked like a living woman sitting or standing by the house. Up close, glassy buttons or painted features marked it as a mockery. Travelers and neighbors who spotted it felt a cold revulsion. The effigy took a person whose life had ended in quiet suffering and turned her into a prop for her husband's morbid amusement. Among the people most offended by that sight was Martha's sister, Belle Foster. Belle had grown up in the same household, shared the same chores, and watched her sister marry a man whose name already carried a shadow. She had seen bruises and fear on Martha's face during visits, had heard hints of what went on inside the ferry house, and had tried in her own ways to offer comfort. Now, as she passed the place and glimpsed the dressed figure sitting stiffly under the eaves, she understood that Cullen was making a spectacle of her sister's memory. It deepened a hatred that ran far beyond ordinary family quarrels. Belle's life took a new direction when she met Thomas Orr, a former Confederate soldier who had turned to teaching. Orr originated from Mississippi and had served in the Confederate ranks before the collapse. After the surrender, he chose to stay in Texas and put his limited formal education to work as a school teacher. The post-war years brought a desperate need for instruction among both white children and freed people, and men like Orr found positions in rural schools supported in part by the Freedmen's Bureau. He agreed to teach in the Sulphur River region, knowing that the area held men who resented the new order. Orr and Belle married, linking his work and his fate to a family already scarred by Cullen's behavior. They settled near the same border belt of farms and woods within reach of the ferry. Thomas devoted his days to a small school that served both black and white pupils, depending on who could attend. The building was crude, a single room with benches and a fireplace, but it represented a break from the old structure in which most learning took place only for select children. Belle supported his efforts, helped with supplies, and tried to build a home that felt different from the turbulent houses she had known under Cullen's shadow. To Baker, the marriage represented a direct challenge. He had treated the Foster family as part of his extended circle, people he could visit, demand help from, and intimidate. Now Belle had bound herself to a man who worked with freed children and answered to the very agency that represented federal power in the region. The presence of a classroom where black students recited lessons and learned to write looked to him like an insult pressed into the earth near his chosen base. In his mind, Orr and Belle had joined forces against him, bringing federal connections into his backyard and offering refuge to people he believed should remain under white control. The feud started with words and escalated quickly. When Cullen encountered Orr on the road, he blocked the way with his horse and demanded to know why the man was teaching black pupils. Orr, who had survived battlefields and shortages, answered that the war had ended and that education was now part of rebuilding. The exchange carried the crackle of gunpowder, even if no weapons were drawn that day. Later, when word reached Baker that Orr had spoken critically of the violence at the ferry, his anger took on a more personal edge. He turned his attention toward Belle with the same cruelty he had shown her sister. On days when he knew she would ride or walk near the ferry, he stepped into her path. He made threats disguised as questions, asking whether she truly believed her new husband could protect her. He reminded her of what had happened to Martha, not with grief, but with a smirk. At night, shots rang out near the Orr home. Bullets slapped into trees or fence rails, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the woods before anyone could give chase. The pattern sent a clear message that the man at the ferry refused to accept their presence and would test their resolve constantly. Belle and Thomas responded by strengthening ties with neighbors who hated what Baker had become. They spoke with local farmers who had watched freed people fall at the riverbank and who worried that their own children might cross his path at the wrong moment. They reached out to Freedmen's bureau officials stationed miles away, sending word that a former Confederate guerrilla was murdering black travelers and harassing a teacher working under federal authority. Reports began to accumulate on desks in bureau offices, describing the Sulphur River country as a place where law had yet to reach. The ferry itself remained the center of Baker's operations. Off-duty from direct confrontations with Orr, he continued to dominate the landing. He sat on benches outside the shack, revolver resting within reach, eyes on the road. When white acquaintances arrived, he sometimes greeted them with rough humor and let them pass after collecting standard tolls. When freedmen walked down the path, carrying bundles or leading lean mules, the mood turned different. Witnesses later told of men ordered to dance for amusement, women forced to endure insults while they waited, and travelers beaten with gun barrels. Those who complained or showed fear risked being shot and left as warnings. The river carried the bodies of some victims away. Others lay on the bank until relatives or strangers lifted them into carts. Graves dug hurriedly in the woods gave no comfort. Families who lost fathers or sons at the ferry often had no recourse. They lacked money for lawyers and lived far from any office where complaints might be heard. Even when word reached Union commanders or bureau agents, the rough terrain, scattered settlements, and the lingering support Baker enjoyed among certain white residents made arrest seem distant. In the Orr household, fear and resolve mixed with each new incident. Thomas continued to open the school doors, calling pupils to recite letters and figures. Bell walked past trees scarred by stray shots to hang wash or fetch water. Each step outside carried the risk that Cullen would choose that day to act. The knowledge of his past crimes hung over them. If he chose to make their home his next target, they expected no mercy and no restraint. By early 1866, the feud had hardened into a line that split households and communities. Some white neighbors continued to share food or shelter with Baker, whether from loyalty, fear, or agreement with his hatred of Reconstruction. Others turned their faces when he rode by and offered quiet help to Orr and Bell. Black families in the region avoided the ferry when they could, spoke in low tones around strangers, and prayed that federal power would finally reach the river in a way that meant more than distant orders. Cullen, for his part, felt stronger with each month that passed without real punishment. He had weathered Confederate defeat, seen Union flags raised over towns, and watched black soldiers patrol roads, yet he still sat at the line ferry with a gun on his knee, deciding who crossed and who did not. The deaths at the river bank, the taunting of a dead wife through a crude effigy, and the slow strangling of a schoolteacher's family became stepping stones in his mind, proofs that he remained untouchable. The stage was set for him to gather a gang that would carry his methods beyond a single landing and into the wider web of roads, farms, and stores that stitched Cass and Miller counties together. By early March 1866, the bottoms of the Sulphur River around Bright Star in Miller County, Arkansas, had turned into the working ground of a new gang built around Cullen Montgomery Baker and a Cass County outlaw named Lee Rames. The war had been over for months, but in that strip of country from Queen City in Texas to the Arkansas line, there were still scattered pickets of federal troops, a handful of Freedmen's bureau officials, and a long list of settlers who had either crossed Baker in the past or spoken too freely about him during his time at the line ferry. Baker and Rames gathered the men who were willing to follow them, men who had carried carbines in Confederate cavalry companies or ridden with irregular bands and now refused to go back to farm work under federal authority. The gang that formed around Baker and Rames moved in small mounted groups, never all together unless a raid demanded it. They used the dark timber along the Sulphur River, the shallow creeks that fed it, and the half-cleared fields between Cass County and Bright Star as their routes. Farmhouses that had quietly fed Baker during the war now became way stations. At some places in Miller County, a lantern hung on a porch rail meant the road was clear. At others, a dark house meant soldiers had recently passed. Baker kept the operation loose, but the structure was clear to anyone inside it. He chose the targets. Lee Rames enforced his decisions when any man hesitated. Within that circle, there was one family that tightened Baker's hold. Lee's younger brother, Seth Rames, rode with them as a scout. Seth knew every shallow crossing on the Sulphur Fork and every cut-through that could take a rider from the river to the wagon road near Queen City in a single night. The Rames brothers treated Cullen Baker as an equal rather than a distant chief, and Baker in turn saw in them the kind of hard men who would carry out orders without question. That bond hardened again when word came back that Seth had been shot down by a Cass County settler named John Salmons. Salmons had been one of the men in the county willing to stand in a posse when Baker's name was mentioned. At some point during a tense encounter, he fired and killed Seth Rames. The details of that brief fight were less important to Baker than the outcome. A man who had killed the brother of his closest lieutenant now lived openly in Cass County, and his house stood within a day's ride of the Sulphur Bottoms. Baker took it as a personal challenge. He told Lee that Seth would be avenged, and from that point Salmons's name moved to the top of the list. The ride to find Salmons began on a raw spring morning when the roads out of the river bottoms were still rutted from winter rains. Baker, Lee Rames, and a handful of picked men crossed into Texas, staying to back trails until they were close enough to smell smoke from cabin chimneys near Salmon's place. They did not ride into the yard in daylight or call for a fair meeting. They waited in the trees and watched the routine of the farm. When Salmons stepped away from his cabin and moved toward his barn with a tool on his shoulder, the riders came in at a gallop. The killing of John Salmons was quick and one-sided. Witnesses later remembered only that there was no warning beyond the thunder of hooves and the first blast of a shotgun. Salmons fell in the yard, hit before he could bring any weapon to bear. Baker made sure there was no doubt about who had done it. He called Salmons by name as he rode past and fired again to leave the body torn and still. For Baker, the point was not only to avenge Seth Rames, but to show every settler who had ever talked about joining a posse that the risk did not end when the man being hunted slipped back into the swamps. Another name soon followed on that list. George W. Barron had ridden in a local posse that once attempted to track Baker through the Cass County woods. That attempt had failed, but Baker did not forget men who had raised a gun in his direction. Barron continued his life as a farmer and local citizen around Queen City, expecting that the war's end and the growing presence of Union troops would keep Baker occupied elsewhere. Instead, during that same post-war season, Baker came back for him. Barron's last ride started as an ordinary trip along one of the narrow wagon roads that cut between Cass County farms. The ruts were dry, and the trees on either side were thick enough that a man could not see far off the track. That made the place perfect for the kind of attack Baker favored. Riders slipped into position ahead of Barron, leaving no tracks where he could see them. When he reached the selected stretch, gun muzzles were already trained on him from the brush. The first shots came from close range, and they were aimed to kill, not to warn or force surrender. Barron fell from his saddle into the dust beside the road. The gang left his body where it lay, the dead horse blocking the narrow track until neighbors came upon the scene and carried him home. These killings around Cass County and the Arkansas border brought a fresh wave of fear that did not match any ordinary wartime raid. The people being cut down now were not armed troops or uniformed patrols. They were men in work clothes moving between their homes and fields. Rumors spread that Baker had said he would wipe out anyone who had ever stood against him. Whether those words were actually spoken or not, his actions in the cases of Salmons and Barron carried that message more clearly than any speech. During this stretch, Baker and Rames did not limit themselves to personal vengeance. They used the gang to enforce their will on anyone who challenged the old racial order. On one farm in Texas, a black man recently freed from slavery took work on land that had once been worked by enslaved laborers under an owner friendly to Baker. With the backing of new laws and the Freedmen's Bureau, that man now drew wages and some measure of protection. Baker refused to accept that change. He rode to the farm with companions, confronted the freedman, and shot him dead on ground that had only recently seen him working with tools instead of chains. The murder of that freedman brought Baker into direct conflict with the Freedmen's Bureau and the federal soldiers who supported it. William G. Kirkman, a bureau agent stationed in northeast Texas, received the reports. He had a mandate to protect the lives and rights of freed people and to enforce basic law where local courts failed. Now he had the name of a man who had killed a freedman for no reason other than race and defiance of federal authority, and that name already had a long history attached to it. Kirkman began to track Baker through official channels, gathering information from field reports and local informants, while he requested military backing for an arrest attempt. Meanwhile, Baker continued to make himself the law in Cass County and along the Sulphur. In early June 1867, he rode into Cass County again and walked into the general store run by John Roden. Roden's business was an ordinary frontier establishment with shelves of flour, coffee, ammunition, and cloth, the kind of place every local family depended on. The day Baker came through, Roden was away and his wife was minding the counter. Baker took advantage of the absence of the owner. He chose items from the shelves as if he intended to pay, then walked out without leaving a cent. When John Roden came back and heard what had happened, he reacted the way many men in that region believed an honest storekeeper had to respond. He saddled his horse, took down a shotgun, and rode to Baker's place to demand payment. He stood on Baker's ground and told him he would not swallow the theft quietly. Baker answered that he would ride back to the store in a few days and settle the bill. Roden accepted that statement, returned home, and waited for the man to appear as promised. 4 days later, on June 5th, Roden heard a horse pull up in front of his store. Instead of a customer coming in the door, a loud voice called for him to step outside. Roden took up the same shotgun he had carried to Baker's house, walked to the threshold, and stepped into view. The shotgun never fired. Before he could bring it to his shoulder, Baker shot him in the chest with a blast of buckshot that threw him back against the doorway. Roden died there at the entrance to his own store, killed for trying to collect payment on goods taken in broad daylight. After killing Roden, Baker did not stay to argue with local authorities. He rode hard for the Arkansas line and used the same network of crossings and hideouts that had sheltered him since the war. A few days later, he had to deal with a problem that could not be solved by terrorizing unarmed civilians. When he moved aboard a ferry in Arkansas, dressed plainly but still carrying weapons, a United States Army sergeant on duty at the crossing recognized him. The sergeant challenged him openly in front of at least one private. He named him as Cullen Baker and moved to arrest him. There was no hesitation between the accusation and the gunfire. Baker pulled his weapon and fired repeatedly into the sergeant at close range, putting several bullets into him before the man could respond. The sergeant died at the landing, his body crumpled near the river. The private who had been with him saw the killing, turned his horse, and rode away at speed to report the murder to his officers farther up the road. News of the ferry killing went quickly through military channels. Officers now had another dead soldier to account for, and yet another example of Baker's willingness to shoot uniformed men at point-blank range. Word spread through the barracks at Jefferson and through the scattered posts along the roads into Cass County that any patrol that stumbled on Baker's gang could expect immediate gunfire. The pursuit grew more determined, but Baker still had sympathizers who warned him whenever blue uniforms appeared too close. On June 25, 1867, William G. Kirkman and several soldiers finally managed to box Baker into a town street rather than a river crossing. They located him in Boston, Texas, which served as a county seat and a small commercial center. The buildings there were closer together than in the open countryside, and the streets gave less room for a fast escape. Kirkman and his detachment approached with care, but in that confined setting, any encounter would turn violent in seconds. When they confronted Baker in Boston, the fight unfolded in front of bystanders who had no time to get away. Shots snapped between soldiers and gang members, echoing off wooden storefronts. Baker aimed at the enlisted men first. Private Albert E. Titus caught the main blast from Baker's shotgun and fell dead in the street. Kirkman himself kept firing even as the outlaw turned his gun toward him. One round from the agent's weapon struck Baker in the arm, tearing flesh and making him drop one gun but not finishing him. Amid the confusion, with smoke hanging between the buildings, Baker managed to break away on horseback and escape out of town, wounded but still free. The killing of Private Titus in a public street changed Baker's status again. It was one thing for him to ambush civilians on isolated roads or shoot a ferry sergeant where only one private saw it. It was another to stand in a town center, kill a United States soldier in front of witnesses, and ride away. Military authorities responded with a reward set at $1,000 payable for his capture, dead or alive. Posters and notices spread through eastern Texas and southwestern Arkansas, carrying his name and a description that every patrol and many civilians already knew. Despite the injury to his arm, Baker did not give up riding with the gang. He shifted more of the physical work to younger men but continued to choose targets. During the second half of 1867, the gang's attention turned again to the new labor arrangements on farms near Bright Star, Arkansas. One particular farmer, Howell Smith, had hired freedmen to work his place. That decision, legal under federal law and encouraged by the Bureau, inflamed men who had lost enslaved labor and now refused to accept black workers as free and protected neighbors. In December 1867, Baker joined a group of men who rode toward Howell Smith's farm with the clear intention of punishing him and the people he had hired. The raiders reached the place at night, moving quietly until they were close to the house and outbuildings. When they moved in, they did so with knives, clubs, and guns in hand. One of Smith's daughters was stabbed during the assault, another was beaten, and a black worker on the farm was shot and killed. The attack turned the family's home into a scene of blood and panic, but Howell Smith did not collapse under the blow. He was armed and ready to defend his place. Smith fought back with his own firearm, returning shots through doors and windows and then from whatever cover he could find. His resistance disrupted the raiders' plan to kill with impunity and ride away untouched. Under fire from the farmhouse, several of the attackers went down wounded. Among those hit was Cullen Baker himself, who took a bullet in the leg. The wound did not kill him, but it slowed him and added to the growing list of injuries that he carried from one escape to the next. The raid on Howell Smith's farm showed the pattern that had taken hold in Cass and Miller counties by the end of 1867. Baker and Lee Rames were no longer only avenging old grudges or robbing isolated travelers. They were leading armed men against civilians who embraced the new order created by emancipation and federal authority. Each murder and each beating sent a clear signal to freedmen, to white Unionists, and to anyone thinking of working with them. Yet these acts also hardened the resolve of men like Howell Smith and officials like William G. Kirkman, who now had a trail of dead soldiers and civilians to lay at Baker's door. By the closing days of 1867, Cullen Baker rode with a wounded arm and a damaged leg, but his grip on the gang and his taste for killing had not eased. The Sulphur River bottom still offered him shelter, and the scattered communities of Cass County and Miller County still lived under the shadow of his name. At the same time, The list of his victims had grown long enough that even hardened outlaws who once admired his defiance began to understand that riding with him meant living one day at a time under the threat of a bullet, a noose, or a poisoned drink waiting at some farmhouse table. Early 1868, the Sulphur River country lay under a ruined peace, with broken rail fences, burned chimneys, and scattered graves marking the last years of war, while Cullen Montgomery Baker rode on bad legs and a damaged arm and still treated the border counties as his own territory. Federal uniforms now appeared more often on the roads, yet every patrol that moved through Cass County or Miller County had to calculate the risk that the man they most wanted might be waiting behind the next stand of timber. The freed families who lived along the Red and Sulphur in those months organized their days and nights around the danger his name carried. Men who had once worked under overseers now paid their own way with wages, yet they chose cabins with fields close by so they would not have to walk far in the dark. At night they slid wooden bars across doors, shoved chairs under latches, and laid children on pallets away from windows. Older boys took turns watching from door cracks for riders on the road. A distant hoofbeat might be nothing, or it might be Baker and the men who rode with him. No one in those households gambled on a slow reaction. Reports of killings and beatings continued to reach the small field offices of the Freedmen's Bureau in northeast Texas. Freedmen came in from Cass County and Bowie County with torn clothing, bandaged arms, and stories of riders who had ordered them off jobs, whipped them for answering back, or shot companions over arguments at farm gates. Many did not know the names of the white men who attacked them. Others spoke Baker's name clearly, describing a lean man who carried a shotgun as easily as most men carried a walking stick, who shouted that no black man would walk those roads without his permission. Bureau clerks wrote the complaints into ledgers while the ink smeared in the humidity, knowing that each line described another incident where civil courts had done nothing. At Boston and Bowie County, the Freedmen's Bureau agent William G. Kirkman read those statements and kept returning to the same signature at the bottom of many of them. He had already faced Baker once in Boston's main street, and had come away with a torn arm and a dead private under his command. That encounter did not push him out of the region. Instead, it hardened his resolve. In his letters, he asked for more soldiers, for authority to move quickly, and for backing when local white juries refused to indict or convict men who killed freed people. He rode to plantations, cabins, and crossroads churches, gathering testimonies and encouraging freedmen to speak despite the risk of retaliation. When he traveled, he carried bureau papers in a satchel and kept a pistol close by. He rode in and out of Boston, through New Boston, and along the rough roads toward the Sulphur Forks, following rumors of Baker's movements. Each new trip exposed him to the possibility that the man he hunted would hear of his route before he even reached his destination. In the same towns where Kirkman talked quietly in back rooms with freedmen and unionists, Baker drank in saloons and listened to former Confederates describe the Bureau agents' efforts with contempt. Both men moved through the same landscape, one trying to document crimes, the other adding to the list. Among white residents who opposed Reconstruction, Baker's reputation shifted during 1868 from that of a local killer to something larger. In gatherings on porches and in low-roofed stores, men spoke of him as a fighter who did what they claimed they could not do openly. They said he had driven United States troops out of saloons, that he had answered federal demands with gunfire, and that he refused to bow his head when Bureau agents rode by. Some of these tales exaggerated events or rearranged facts, but the effect mattered more than the details. In their talk, he became a symbol of defiance, a man who met the occupation with shot instead of words. Baker encouraged that view whenever it served him. When he met white supporters in Cass County or Miller County, he spoke loudly about killing soldiers and Bureau men. He let them repeat his claims until they sounded like confirmed history, and he used their admiration to secure food, shelter, and information. Some furnished him with horses and ammunition, convinced that every cartridge he fired at a federal patrol counted as a blow for their region. Others gave reluctantly, handing over supplies from fear that refusal would bring a visit from his gang after dark. In either case, those households extended his reach. The United States authorities responded by increasing the price on his head and circulating descriptions that marked him as a murderer, not a champion. A reward of $1,000 stood as a promise that any man who delivered him to a military post could claim more money than most farmers saw in many years of work. The amount appeared in newspapers, on notices nailed to courthouse doors, and in brief items read aloud at meetings. It attracted bounty hunters and drifters, but it also pushed Baker to answer in his own fashion. That autumn, broadsides appeared in parts of Arkansas carrying his answer to the reward notices. They named the state governor Powell Clayton and offered a higher sum for his death than the government had put on Baker's own capture. The sheets were printed in plain type and tacked to walls where men who sympathized with ex-Confederate guerrillas would see them. The message was direct. If the state paid to have him killed, he would set his own price on the head of the man who signed Reconstruction proclamations. Those broadsides did not give him any legal authority, but they made clear that he considered himself an opponent of the state itself and wanted others to see him that way. In the settlements where freedmen lived, those posters did not change daily reality. Night riders still came through on narrow roads, firing at cabins to remind residents that armed white men remained in control. In some communities, women took children to relatives farther away, tense and exhausted from listening for horses every evening. Men weighed the choice between staying and facing sporadic violence or leaving and risking an ambush on the road. Many chose to stay on land they knew, even while they understood that the man whose name moved through whispered conversations as a curse had supporters on nearby farms. During those months, Baker's gang shifted in size and commitment. Some riders who had followed him from the sulfur bottoms grew tired of the constant fear of soldiers, the long watches at river crossings, and the knowledge that the next raid might end at the wrong end of a rifle. They were hard men, but they still valued their own lives more than his pride. Fights broke out inside the group when he drank and accused them of cowardice. One left after such an argument and never returned, choosing a distant county over the chance that Baker would come back to settle the dispute with a shotgun. Others remained close. Men like Lee Rames stayed in the saddle beside him, helping choose targets and setting the pace for raids. Riders who did not match their level of ruthlessness drifted away or found themselves pushed to the edge of the gang's activities. The core that remained near Baker by mid-1868 were men who had already proven their readiness to kill without hesitation. They had seen him shoot United States soldiers, freedmen, and local farmers, and they had no illusions about the kind of leader they followed. For the Freedmen's Bureau, the pattern of violence left little doubt that the problem ran deeper than simple lawlessness. Offices in Texas and Arkansas recorded Baker's name in reports that linked him to shootings on plantations, assaults on black workers, and threats against school teachers and ministers. Those reports moved up the chain to district headquarters, where officers debated how to use limited troops and whether local white juries would ever convict him even if he stood in a courtroom. Every delay meant more time for him to ride, and every new killing undercut the Bureau's attempt to show freed people that the government could protect them. In Boston, the conflict between those two views of Baker reached a new height. On one side, freedmen came into town clutching hats in their hands, asking for letters of protection or for permission to move to safer areas. On the other, former Confederates walked the same streets and told each other that the Bureau agent based there was stirring up trouble. William G. Kirkman walked through that town as both a federal representative and a marked man. He knew that his name appeared in hostile conversations around kitchen tables and in campfires near the sulfur. His work brought him closer to the man those talkers admired and excused. Kirkman continued to travel despite those risks. He visited farms, where freed workers had been driven off by threats, wrote letters for men who wanted to claim unpaid wages, and inspected schools that had opened for black children under Bureau support. On those trips, he did not always carry a full escort. Troops were spread thin, and some routes seemed quiet for weeks at a time. Each uneventful journey could encourage the thought that Baker and his gang were occupied elsewhere, even as new reports suggested that they watched roads near Boston and New Boston closely. As the summer of 1868 turned toward autumn, the talk around Baker grew more heated. Supporters bragged that he had driven Bureau agents out of certain districts and would do the same in Boston if given the chance. Enemies warned that such talk would only invite more troops and harsher measures. Through it all, Baker stayed in motion. He rested at friendly houses, moved through the woods near the Sulphur Forks, and rode to small settlements where saloons still served him without question. His injuries from earlier clashes gave him a limp and limited the way he handled a saddle, but they did not keep him from raising a gun. On October 7, 1868, William G. Kirkman rode or walked through Boston in the course of his duties, moving through a town where his federal commission and his earlier pursuit of Baker were well known. Along a route near the community, armed men waited. The attack came without warning that morning. Shots hit Kirkman before he could bring any weapon to bear. He fell under the weight of the rounds, dying in the county where he had spent months trying to defend freed people and enforce new laws. Word of the killing went out quickly. For freedmen in Bowie County and nearby areas, the death of the Bureau agent meant that the one man who had carried their complaints to higher offices now lay in the ground. For former Confederates who hated Reconstruction, the news spread with a different tone. Some spoke openly that the agent had met the fate he deserved for siding with federal power. Others kept their approval private, but still treated the event as a sign that Baker and men like him could strike even at officials backed by Washington. Military commanders and bureau officers recorded the assassination in official correspondence, and in later accounts tied it to Baker and his associates. The killing fit the pattern that had already marked northeast Texas and southwest Arkansas for several years. A man who interfered with Baker's attacks on freed people or who tried to bring him into court ended up dead in a yard, on a road, or in a town street. With Kirkman gone, the contest between federal authority and local terror shifted again. Soldiers still patrolled, reports still moved across desks, and notices offering money for Baker's capture still hung on walls. But the man at the center of those efforts had added a federal agent to the long list of victims whose names were spoken in the border country, whenever people talked about the most dangerous killer in their midst. October 24, 1868. Along the road that linked the Arkansas River country to the interior, a small mounted party moved in the chill of early morning, carrying the weight of federal authority into a region where that authority had cost men their lives. Major P.J. Andrews rode at the head, a veteran officer now tasked with keeping order in a state still raw from war. Beside him traveled Second Lieutenant Hiram F. Willis, serving as a Freedmen's Bureau agent responsible for supervising field offices and protecting freed people in southwestern Arkansas. With them rode a black assistant whose work included scouting, delivering messages, and translating the fears of freed families into reports that officers could carry back to headquarters. Sheriff Standell of Little Rock accompanied the group, representing local law strapped to a county that still divided along wartime lines. They had left before sunrise from a settlement tied by freight and river traffic to Little Rock, following a rutted dirt track that wound through timber and patches of tilled ground. Frost clung to grass in the shaded hollows. Smoke rose thinly from scattered cabins. Andrews kept his eyes on the road ahead, thinking through the complaints that had pushed this trip onto the schedule. Reports from Freedmen's bureau offices and military posts had stacked up naming the same killer, the same gang, the same stretch of counties along the Red River and Sulphur Forks. The man at the center of those reports had already shot down a bureau agent in Texas and soldiers at ferries and town crossings. Now, Arkansas officials wanted to show that their own officers would not shrink from confronting him. Hiram Willis understood the risk more clearly than most. His work as superintendent and agent in earlier years had taken him into small towns, plantation quarters, and remote clearings where freed people tried to build new lives under contracts that whites often ignored. He had seen the scars on backs and arms, listened to women speak in low voices about night riders, and written letters that described lynchings and beatings in careful, restrained language for distant superiors. Many of those letters bore the same name in their lists of offenders. When orders came down for him to join Andrews and Sheriff Standell on a movement toward areas where that man and his followers had been seen, he accepted without hesitation, even with full knowledge of previous ambushes. The black assistant who rode with them had his own reasons to go. He had watched freed families around the Red River Valley bolt doors at dusk, had heard older men say that there was no point in reporting crimes because no court would punish a white killer, and had decided that someone had to help bridge the gap between those cabins and the officers in uniform. His presence on this trip meant that if they met freed people along the way, he could speak plainly to them and bring fresh information back. It also meant that if they ran into men loyal to the outlaw they hunted, he would be marked as a traitor in the eyes of those riders. Ahead of the officers, several bends in the road led through timber broken by brush and old fence lines. In one of those patches, mounted men waited. They had ridden in during the dark, slipping off the main track and leading their horses into a stand of trees where low branches hid forms and bridles. Among them sat Cullen Montgomery Baker, his arm and leg still carrying old injuries but his hands steady on the stock of a shotgun. He knew the route Andrews' party would take. He knew their purpose. In his mind, this was not merely a clash with officers. It was a test of whether the state and federal government could reach into the terrain he claimed. The men with him were drawn from the hardened core of the gang that had followed him since the Sulphur River raids. They knew Willis's name from bureau reports that had filtered back through hostile neighbors and from newspaper pieces describing his efforts to bring men like Baker into courts. They knew that the presence of a major and a sheriff meant this was no routine patrol. Their leader had told them that if they let this party pass unchallenged, more such parties would follow, better armed and more numerous. The ambush was their answer. As the sound of hoofbeats reached the concealed riders, Baker raised a hand, and conversation ceased. The approaching group came into view one by one, horses picking their way through the ruts and pools. Andrews's posture in the saddle, Willis's uniform, the sheriff's badge, and the black assistant's careful watch of the surrounding timber were all visible in those few seconds before anyone fired. For the officers, the roadside brush looked only like another stretch of post-war Arkansas landscape. For Baker, it provided cover enough. When Andrews reached the center of the bend, Baker stepped into the open and fired the first shot. Buckshot tore into the major at short distance, knocking him backwards in the saddle and then down to the road. Almost at the same instant, rifles and pistols in the thicket opened up on the rest of the party. Willis grabbed for his own weapon, but rounds struck him before he could bring it to bear. He slid from his horse, hitting the ground near the man he had accompanied into so many tense meetings with planters and bureau clerks. The black assistant tried to wheel his horse away from the gunfire, hoping to break through the other side of the curve and reach open ground. But the gang had positioned themselves to cut off that route. Bullets found him as he turned. The horse plunged and went down. The rider fell beneath it, hit again as he struggled to rise. For Baker and his men, witnesses who could describe their formation were as much targets as the officers themselves. The killings at the Bend reduced the party's core strength in a matter of seconds. Sheriff Stondell drew and fired, managing to discharge his weapon despite the suddenness of the attack. A shot from his pistol caught one of the ambushers, who fell back into the brush. The sheriff's own body took rounds in return. He slumped in his saddle, then slid down, bleeding heavily. For a moment, the road was a scene of fallen horses, wounded men, and animals trying to pull free from reins that held them near the gunfire. The gang advanced cautiously, using trees and the bulk of downed mounts as shields. When Baker saw that Andrews, Willis, and the black assistant no longer moved in any way suggesting resistance, he held up his hand again and signaled his riders to cease firing. They closed in on the bodies, checking for signs of life. Willis still showed faint movement. A pistol was raised and fired into him at close range, ending any chance he might have had to survive long enough to testify. Andrews lay still, his chest ruined by the first blast. The black assistant had already stopped breathing, his blood soaking into the dirt and leaves under his shoulders. Sheriff Stondell, though wounded, did not die on that ground. Other men in the party, less severely hit or shielded by fallen horses, managed to pull him away from the immediate line of fire. While the gang focused on finishing those closest, two riders spurred out of the kill zone with the injured sheriff between them. They followed a side path away from the ambush, forcing their mounts through brush to open a gap. Baker's men fired a few shots after them, but the angle and the thickness of the trees made pursuit difficult. The priority in Baker's mind remained the officers who had come as symbols of Reconstruction power. The surviving sheriff would later carry news of that day back to Little Rock. Once the shooting stopped, the gang stripped the dead of weapons, cartridges, and any papers that might prove useful. They rifled saddlebags looking for orders, maps, or lists that mentioned forthcoming operations. Whether or not they found such documents, they left the bodies in the road or pulled them a short distance into the brush. The scene they abandoned behind them contained every mark needed for future investigators to understand what had taken place. But for the moment, it stood as a clear statement that Baker and his followers could intercept and destroy an official party of that rank without immediate consequence. News of the ambush reached Arkansas authorities through scattered channels, carried first by the survivors and then by couriers. The killings of Major Andrews and Lieutenant Willis and of the black assistant who had worked beside them sent a shock through the ranks of Freedmen's Bureau personnel and Army officers in the state. Dispatches noted that a Bureau agent with direct responsibility for protecting former slaves in southwestern Arkansas had been cut down in the line of duty, along with an officer and a black colleague. The sheriff's wounds underscored the danger to local officials who cooperated with federal agents. For freed communities in the Red River and Arkansas River corridors, the deaths read as confirmation that even high-ranking officers could be killed on the same roads they traveled. In cabins along the river bottoms, men and women who had spoken with Willis in earlier months remembered his questions and attempts to secure contracts. Some had argued with him over the terms he enforced, but they had understood that his presence represented a government that at least claimed to stand between them and the worst abuses. When they learned that he had fallen under gunfire in an ambush widely attributed to Baker's gang, their conversation shifted. If a white officer in uniform could be taken from his horse and left in the dirt, what chance did they have if they openly aided the hunt for the killer? The impact extended across the Red River into Texas. Notices already offering a $1,000 reward for Baker's capture now had more names to list beyond soldiers and local farmers. White and black residents around Queen City and Boston repeated the story in their own words, adding detail each time. Some white men spoke with grim satisfaction, saying that the Bureau and Army had brought this on themselves by pushing too hard. Others, even those who shared Baker's wartime loyalties, recognized that this level of open violence against federal officers would bring heavier troops and stricter measures. Among freedmen in Cass County, the story had a different edge. They saw clearly that anyone who worked closely with bureau agents or army officers now painted a target on his own back. In that tense atmosphere, talk of the reward on Baker's head became both temptation and danger. One man who heard those figures and weighed them in his mind was a freedman named Jerry Sheffield, living near Queen City. Sheffield was not part of any official posse or bureau staff, but he had friends and relatives who had suffered under Baker's raids. He had heard the same figure repeated again and again, $1,000 for Baker, dead or alive, and he knew what that kind of money could mean for a man who had left slavery with nothing but the clothes he wore. In late autumn of 1868, Sheffield began to speak more openly than others about the possibility of claiming that reward. Around stove fires and in fields, he told fellow freedmen that if he got the chance, he would help deliver Baker to the authorities. Some remembered him saying that he would track the outlaw or provide information that would lead soldiers straight to his camp. The exact words changed with each recollection, but the substance remained the same. Sheffield was not whispering in corners. He was making clear statements that reached ears far beyond the cabins where he thought he spoke among trusted men. Word of his talk traveled quickly through a region where spies and informants watched both sides. White men who still sympathized with Baker and his gang heard the freedman's name attached to talk of the reward. Some were present when Sheffield spoke, standing in the back of crowds or listening from doorways. Others picked up the story secondhand and carried it down the road. Before long, the idea that a freedman east of Queen City intended to profit from Baker's capture reached men close to the outlaw himself. When the rumor reached Baker, it cut straight to the center of his pride. The $1,000 reward already insulted him in his own mind, a price placed on his head by a government he hated. The idea that a black man in a county he had long treated as his own might help collect that money added a new level of fury. He saw in Sheffield's reported words not only betrayal but defiance. In previous years he had killed freed people who stood between him and his goals. Now, a freedman was talking about joining the hunt against him. On December 6, 1868, Sheffield walked a road about 2 miles east of Queen City, traveling between settlements that had sprung up near the wagon routes. The day was cold but clear, the ruts hardened by earlier freezes. He moved on foot, carrying what little he needed for the trip, perhaps expecting to meet friends or family along the way. He knew the danger of being alone on those roads, but like many men in that period, he had limited choices. If work or kin lay along that path, he had to take it, trusting to daylight and quick eyes. Riders approached from behind, closing distance with the measured pace of men who did not hurry for fear of notice. When they drew near enough, one called his name. Sheffield turned, recognizing at least one of the faces in the group. The riders spread slightly across the road, creating a line that blocked any easy retreat into the brush. Guns hung from holsters and saddles. In that moment, the freedman understood that the rumors he had heard about Baker's reach were no longer talk. They had ridden out of the stories and into the road where he stood. The exchange that followed did not last long. Questions were asked about his recent comments. Accusations were made that he had boasted of helping bring Baker in for the reward. Sheffield answered that he had spoken in anger, that he meant nothing by it, or that he had been misunderstood. Whatever the exact phrases, the riders were not there to negotiate. They had come to make an example. A shotgun was raised, leveled at his chest, and fired. The blast hit him at close range, throwing him backwards toward the ditch beside the road. As he fell, another shot struck him. The riders watched until his movements stopped. Some accounts speak of additional rounds fired into his body as he lay still. A final emphasis on what happened to a freedman who talked too boldly about joining the pursuit of their leader. When they were sure he would not rise, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving him in the dust and weeds near the roadside, within sight of the tracks his own feet had just made. Neighbors found him later, alerted by the sound of shots or by the absence of a man expected to arrive by a certain hour. They lifted his body into a wagon or onto a makeshift litter and carried him back toward Queen City. For his friends and relatives, there was no mystery about why he had been targeted. The timing and the manner of death matched the story that had circulated for weeks. A freedman who had spoken against Baker and mentioned the reward had been executed in broad daylight on a public road. Sheffield's killing closed the narrow window that some freedmen had imagined when they first heard of the federal bounty. The idea that they could turn the man who terrorized their communities into a source of money and protection now looked like a trap. If anyone had doubted that Baker would kill black men who even talked about cooperating with soldiers, the body east of Queen City answered that question. In the Red River Valley cabins, men and women lowered their voices again, returning to the guarded speech that had marked the earliest days after emancipation. For Baker and the hardcore still around him, the shootings of Major Andrews, Hiram Willis, the black assistant in Arkansas, and the freedmen in Texas marked a clear pattern. They were no longer only punishing individuals who had crossed them in card games or farm disputes. They were striking at the network that tied freed people to federal power, from agents in offices to black men who dared to speak of helping the army. By the close of 1868, his enemies ranged from Washington officials to the poorest freedmen walking a county road. The list of his victims now spanned high-ranking officers, local sheriffs, and laborers whose only weapon had been their willingness to talk. December 1868 settled hard over the pine hills and river bottoms of northeast Texas and southwest Arkansas. Frost clung to fence rails, muddy roads turned stiff in the mornings, and the gang that had once ridden behind Cullen Montgomery Baker with easy confidence had been cut down to a handful of men who no longer trusted him. Years of killings, ambushes, and night rides had drawn soldiers, bureau officers, and armed civilians into a tightening ring. Inside that ring, Baker still moved, but the ground under him felt less secure with every day that passed. The split began inside his own camp. For a long time, Lee Rames had been the man nearest to him, a rider who had shared his raids, helped pick targets, and backed his decisions even when they meant shooting unarmed farmers or freedmen on lonely roads. That loyalty cracked when Baker tried to hang Thomas Orr and Joe Davis at a dogwood tree, and then raged that they were still breathing later. When he discovered that someone had cut the ropes and let the two men live, he announced in front of the others that whoever had done it would pay with his life. The outburst landed on men who had watched him kill over insults and testimony. They understood that this new threat pointed directly at one of them. In that silence, Lee Rames stepped forward and admitted that he had been the one to spare Orr and Davis. He did not apologize. He drew his pistols and faced his own leader with barrels up, telling him that if he wanted to enforce that threat, he would have to start by shooting the man who had ridden beside him for years. For once, Cullen backed away from a direct challenge. He cursed, lowered his own weapon, and let the moment pass. Everyone present saw that the old order inside the gang had been broken. From that day, talk among the riders turned from which farm to rob, next to how long they were willing to keep staking their lives on Baker's temper. Some counted the number of dead soldiers, bureau agents, freedmen, and neighbors already laid at his feet and weighed it against the reward that now stood on his head. Others remembered how easily he had turned his rage toward men inside his own camp. In quiet conversations away from his hearing, they agreed that they had had enough. The break itself came in plain daylight. One morning in the river country, Lee Rames mounted his horse, announced that he was finished following Baker, and rode away toward safer ground. Several riders looked at Baker, then at Rames, and chose to fall in behind the man who no longer took orders from their old chief. Hoofbeats faded up the trail, leaving behind a thin campfire, a few scattered bedrolls, and the man who had once been the center of the gang sitting there with only a single companion still at his side. The last man who stayed with him was Matthew Kirby, known everywhere in that border region as Dummy Kirby. He was a compact Irishman with quick hands and a watchful face. Around strangers he acted as if he could not hear and could not speak, tilting his head in a puzzled way and moving his lips without sound. The act fooled many. People talked freely in his presence, assuming he caught nothing. In truth, he paid attention to every gesture and tone. Over years beside Baker, he had proven his value as a scout, a listener, and an extra gun who did not argue over who got the credit. Kirby's silence suited Baker in those last weeks. A man who never challenged decisions would not ask why they kept attacking Freedmen, why the list of dead civilians kept growing, or why the reward notices now named specific officers and farmers alongside anonymous victims. Baker's arm and leg carried old wounds that ached in the cold. He no longer rode as easily as he once had, but he still kept pistols at his belt and a shotgun within reach. With the others gone, he put more work onto Kirby, ordering him to watch approaches to camp, tend horses, and stand guard while he slept. The shrinking of the gang did not immediately calm the region. Most people living along the Sulphur Forks and the roads between Queen City and Bright Star did not count rifles in his escort. They cared only that the man who had shot farmers in their yards and freedmen in their tracks was still alive and still armed. For black families, the killing of Jerry Sheffield on the road east of Queen City remained fresh. The news that Baker now rode with only one partner did not feel like relief. Two men on fast horses could still stop anyone on a narrow lane and end a life in a single blast. White neighbors saw the change differently. Farmers and small landowners who had watched him ride past their gates with a string of armed men understood how much that sight had depended on fear and loyalty inside the gang. The fact that those riders had peeled away showed that his hold on them had weakened. Men like William Foster, Robert Spell, I.M. Dempsey, and John Chambly had counted the dead in their counties and the threats thrown at their own doors. Now they saw a chance to act that had not existed when a dozen guns backed every word Baker spoke. Chambly tried first to go through formal channels. On December 24th, he traveled to Jefferson and met with General George P. Buell, the United States officer in charge of the military district. In that office, he described what Baker and his followers had done in Cass County and across the line, listing by name the farmers shot in their yards, the freedmen gunned down on the roads, and the agents ambushed in their duties. He asked for a strong mounted detachment to move into the Bright Star and Bloomberg area and finish the business. The general listened, acknowledged the reports, and spoke in terms of future movements and limited resources. Chambly rode home with polite words but no promise of immediate cavalry on his roads. With that effort exhausted, the men closest to the terror in the Sulphur country turned to each other. In cabins and back, rooms where curtains were drawn and pistols lay within reach, William Foster, Spell, Dempsey, Chambly, Joe Davis, and Thomas Orr met and talked in low voices. Each carried specific memories that needed no retelling inside that circle. Foster knew the way Baker had treated his daughter Martha, and the way her life had ended with his hand in it. Davis and Orr bore the scars on their necks from the night they had swung in nooses under a dogwood branch, left to strangle until a knife blade cut the ropes. Spell and Dempsey had heard their own names used in threats. Every man at the table had a reason to want the killer gone that was carved into his own family's history. They did not speak in grand terms or pretend that they were launching a campaign on behalf of the whole country. They spoke like fathers, husbands, and neighbors who had watched the same rider tear apart every promise of peace the end of the war was supposed to bring. They knew that federal troops might pass through from time to time, but they also knew that a man like Baker could slip into thickets, hide in sympathetic houses, and wait out each patrol. If the problem was going to be solved, it would have to be done with hands that knew the local creeks and fence lines better than any soldier from another state. While those talks unfolded, Baker and Kirby adjusted their own patterns. Without the gang, camping in open bottoms or in pine thickets left them exposed. Two men could not cover every angle. They relied more heavily on houses that had sheltered them before, especially the Foster place and a small number of other farms near the state line. In those dwellings, they ate hot meals, dried their clothes, and slept in real beds while Baker complained that old comrades had deserted him and bragged that he still scared Bureau men out of the countryside. The atmosphere inside those houses had changed. Years earlier, some of those families had welcomed him as a rough but useful ally, a man who could scare off thieves or ride beside them against common enemies. Now they saw him as a danger that drew risk to every person under their roofs. Women carried coffee in with steady hands and thanked him politely, then stepped back and avoided lingering in the room. Children were told to keep away from the visitors, to stay in back rooms or out of sight. Older men who might once have matched his jokes now watched him carefully and chose their words with care. The memory of Martha's life and death weighed heavily inside the Foster home in particular. Her father and siblings remembered the strain that had marked her face while she lived as his wife, the sickness that had consumed her, and the gruesome dummy he had made from her clothes after she died. Each time he sat at their table after that, they had seen not just a son-in-law, but the man who had turned her suffering into a cruel joke. That memory sat like a third presence beside him and Kirby as they warmed themselves by the fire. Kirby did his best to keep his employer safe. He checked doors before they slept, tested window latches, and walked the yards after dark to see whether anyone watched from the shadows. He scanned faces at every place where they stopped to eat, noting who stared too long and who looked away too quickly. If a stranger approached a barn or stepped into a yard where they rested, Kirby stepped between the newcomer and the house, eyes narrowed, hand near his gun. His habit of acting deaf and mute made some visitors careless, but Baker trusted those silent observations and followed his warnings. That vigilance had already broken up more than one attempt to catch them. In small settlements near the Sulphur, groups of men had gathered behind stores with the idea of grabbing Baker when he stepped outside after a drink. Kirby had seen the way horses were tied, the way men stood too stiffly near corners, and had urged Baker to leave by side doors or to stay mounted. Those missed chances weighed heavily on neighbors who wanted him gone. Now, as winter deepened, they understood that any plan would have to account for the extra set of eyes at his shoulder. For the Freedmen scattered through the same territory, the breaking of the gang and the shift to quieter movements did not bring any sense of safety. They still saw Baker and Kirby passing on the roads, still heard shots in the night, and still knew that anyone who talked openly to soldiers about his movements risked ending up like Jerry Sheffield. The fear that had driven them to the Freedmen's Bureau offices in earlier months now sat heavier and more silent. Men who had once spoken of the reward on Baker's head no longer mentioned such matters anywhere near strangers. By the opening days of January 1869, the meetings in and around Bright Star had hardened into a clear decision. Foster, Spell, Dempsey, Chambly, Davis, and Orr agreed that the next time Baker settled himself under a friendly roof within their reach, they would not wait for another group of soldiers, another bureau agent, or another sheriff's posse to step in front of his guns. They would take their own stand inside the same network of houses and fields he had used for years. That chance arrived quickly. In the first days of the new year, Baker and Kirby turned their horses toward the familiar cluster of farms near the Texas and Arkansas line, following the worn tracks that led past the Lamar place and along the approaches to the Foster home near Bloomberg. The sky stood clear, the air was sharp, and the ground crunched under the horses' hooves. From the saddle, it looked like another winter ride toward a house where they could warm themselves and eat. Inside that house, and in neighboring yards, Men who had sat through long nights of planning saw dust rising on the road and knew that the moment they had been waiting for was coming up the lane with Cullen Baker and dummy Kirby at its head. January 6, 1869. Cold light came up over the farms near Bloomberg in Cass County while frost held the grass and smoke rose straight from chimneys. And on that morning, Cullen Montgomery Baker and Matthew Dummy Kirby rode toward the Foster place, believing they were heading for shelter instead of the end of their lives. The narrow road led past split-rail fences and winter fields, then turned into a yard ringed by bare trees and outbuildings. William Foster's house stood there, plain and weathered, the boards familiar to Baker from earlier visits when his marriage to Martha had given him a claim on the doorstep. Now he approached as a hunted man with a price on his head, carrying scars in his arm and leg and counting on old ties to keep him safe for another day. Inside the Foster home, the atmosphere did not match the quiet face of the yard. Men who had shared the same winter air as Baker for years had already gathered under that roof, having slipped in along side paths and back gates so that no wandering eye on the road would see a crowd forming. William Foster moved between rooms with the tense calm of a man who had seen what Cullen had done to his daughters and to his community, and had decided that the risk of hosting him one more time was less than the risk of letting him ride away again. Near him stood neighbors who had long since reached the same conclusion. Men like Robert Spell and I.M. Dempsey, along with Joe Davis and Thomas Orr, who still felt the marks from the night they had been left hanging under a dogwood tree. They had talked through this moment in earlier winter meetings, weighing the danger of facing Baker in open country against the advantage of catching him under a roof where numbers and surprise could finally work against him instead of in his favor. In those discussions, they agreed that they would not confront him alone in a yard or on a road where his shotgun and pistols could do their worst. They would wait until he dismounted, came inside, and was seated with at least some of his weapons laid aside. The Foster home, which he still believed to be friendly ground, offered that chance. On the table and sideboard, food and drink had been set out in a way that would not raise suspicion. Crockery dishes held simple winter fare. Jugs and bottles stood within easy reach, their contents dark in the dim light of the room. Later stories would disagree on exactly what those vessels contained. Some men who recounted the day said that at least one jug and some of the food had been dosed beforehand with strychnine, a poison that would grip the stomach and muscles and leave even a strong man doubled over. Other accounts described the plan as a straightforward killing by gunfire once the visitors were inside. What every version shared was the presence of armed neighbors in the house and the decision that Baker and Kirby would not walk back out under their own power. The two riders came into the yard with the casual posture of men used to taking what hospitality they wished. Baker sat his horse stiffly, his injured leg making dismounting slower than it once had been. Kirby moved with more ease, his eyes moving across the windows and doors the way they always did, searching for unusual movement. No soldiers stood in the lane, no armed posse waited in plain view. Only familiar faces and the usual farm sounds greeted them. That was enough, after years of relying on the same houses for food and cover to ease their guard. They tied their horses and stepped up onto the porch. Inside, chairs scraped and someone called a welcome from the main room. Baker walked in ahead of Kirby, shrugging off the cold and the ache in his limbs. He carried his shotgun and sidearms as he always did, heavy with metal even indoors. The Foster family moved carefully around him, bringing plates and cups, speaking as lightly as they could manage. The men who had gathered there as his enemies kept to the edges, forcing smiles and easy phrases while their hands stayed close to hidden weapons. If poison touched lips in those first minutes, its effects did not have time to run a full course before steel and powder settled the matter. Whether he swallowed tainted whiskey or not, the decisive move came when the armed neighbors shifted from hosts to attackers. At a signal understood among them but not spoken aloud, chairs pushed back and guns came out from under coats and behind furniture. Baker saw the movement and jerked toward his weapons, but the room had been chosen precisely because it left him no clear path. Muzzles pointed at him and at Kirby from more than one direction. Foster had the weight of a shotgun in his hands. Spell and Dempsey raised rifles. Davis and Orr held pistols that had waited years for this meeting. For a heartbeat, there was silence. A man who had forced freedmen to dance at gunpoint and had shot farmers in their own yards now stood looking at farmers and neighbors who had decided they would no longer live by his rules. That pause broke the moment someone squeezed a trigger. The first blast struck Baker hard enough to drive him back toward the fireplace. Buckshot or heavy lead tore into his body. He staggered, tried to lift a gun, and met a second wave of fire. Rounds hit his chest and side, then his head. He fell close to the chimney bricks, the same structure that had warmed him on earlier visits now serving as the backdrop to his death. Kirby tried to return fire, but there was no clear way out for him either. Bullets slammed into him before he could bring his gun to bear. He dropped near his leader, hit repeatedly as the men in the room poured fire into both bodies until there was no chance either man would move again. When the shooting stopped, powder smoke hung in the air and ears rang in the sudden quiet. Boards and plaster showed fresh splinter marks. The floor near the hearth was slick. The armed men kept their guns up for a moment, watching the fallen forms for any twitch that might signal one last attack. Baker's reputation had been built on sudden violence. No one in that room intended to give him the smallest chance to rise. Only when it was clear he was dead did they step closer. The bodies told a story in the immediate aftermath. Baker lay with multiple wounds, his clothes ripped and soaked through. Kirby was in no better condition. When the neighbors checked his weapons, they found that he had not managed to fire effectively inside the tight space. The men who had carried the weight of fear for years now stood over two lifeless figures and felt a different strain, the realization that they had killed the most notorious killer in their region, and that soldiers, bureau officers, and vengeful supporters would soon want details. There was no thought of quiet burial on Foster land. The killings had been carried out not only to protect families but also to answer the challenge laid down by Baker's murders of freedmen, farmers, soldiers, and federal agents. The men in the house understood that authorities in Jefferson and Little Rock would need proof. They also recognized the value in their own minds and in the minds of their neighbors of showing the county that the man whose name had filled so many terrified conversations could now be seen lying still. They stripped the bodies of the weapons that had weighed down his belt and pockets on countless rides. From Baker, they took a heavy double-barreled shotgun, several revolvers, small concealed pistols, and an assortment of knives that seemed to spill from every section of his clothing. Even dead, he carried more iron than many men wore into battle. Beside the guns and knives lay papers, including clippings that celebrated his notoriety. Those would help confirm to distant officers that the right man had fallen. The corpses were then dragged or hauled from the house and loaded for transport. Accounts described them being pulled through Bloomberg, the lifeless forms bouncing or sliding as they passed the same yards and cabins where people had once watched him ride by alive. White residents stepped into doorways to look. Some crossed themselves or shook their heads. Others spoke words that had waited years in their throats. Freedmen watched from fields and paths, eyes tracking the same man who had ordered tolls at ferries and shot black travelers when they answered back. On that day, they saw him with his weapons silent and his body subject to the same rough handling he had inflicted on so many others. From Bloomberg, the remains went on toward Jefferson, the closest significant federal outpost and commercial center. Soldiers and officers there had seen the name Cullen M. Baker in reports tied to dead sergeants, ambushed patrols, and murdered bureau agents. When news arrived that men from Cass County had killed him and were bringing the body in, They prepared to verify the claim. The wagon or dragged load reached the outpost, and the corpse was displayed so that officers and local citizens could see for themselves that the man whose description had appeared on reward notices now lay stiff and silent. Witnesses noted the arsenal taken from him and the way his body had been riddled with bullets. To the army, this display served as confirmation that the reward notice could be closed and that one of the most persistent killers of soldiers in the region no longer needed to be hunted. To freedmen who reached Jefferson, the site gave a different kind of confirmation. The man who had blocked roads and shot those who tried to move freely now lay under guard in a place where he could no longer decide who crossed a river or walked a lane. After the formalities of identification and display, his body went to Oakwood Cemetery in Jefferson. There he received a marked grave, an outcome that many of his victims never had. The stone that eventually stood over him identified him as a member of a Confederate cavalry unit, a reminder that he had ridden under Confederate colors before turning his weapons on fellow civilians, freedmen, and federal officers after the war ended. No inscription on the marker listed the farmers, soldiers, and black laborers whose deaths stretched back through the years to his first known killings. Kirby's remains did not receive the same lasting attention. His name appears in local records and recollections as the silent companion who stayed when others left, and who died in the same room as his leader. His death, like that of many associates in Baker's circle, underlined how closely tied their fates had become to one man's refusal to accept peace on any terms that did not leave him in control. The neighbors who had carried out the killing faced their own aftermath. They answered questions from army officers and civil authorities, explaining that they had acted against a man with a long record of murders, and that they had done so in the absence of effective protection from the state. Monetary reward followed. Men who had spent years watching Baker ride near their fields now received federal money for ending his life. Some used that cash to shore up farms that had been strained by war and Reconstruction. Others treated it as compensation for years of fear that no one could truly balance. News of Baker's death spread quickly through the border country and beyond. Newspapers took up the story, printing accounts that sometimes leaned on rumor as much as on sworn testimony. Reports claimed that he had killed astonishing numbers of people, figures that pushed him into the realm of almost unreal monstrosity. Other writers tried to cast him as a rough champion of former Confederates, a man who had resisted occupation until he himself fell under a fusillade. Those printed words could not change the specific facts known to freed families and to towns where names like John Roden, William G. Kirkman, Major Andrews, and Hiram Willis were written on graves or in official registers. In the Sulphur River and Red River settlements, the practical meaning of his death became clear in the months that followed. Freedmen still faced violence from night riders and local groups that rejected Reconstruction, but one particular threat no longer hovered over every ride to a new job or every trip to a bureau office. No one would meet Baker himself on a ferry landing again. School teachers who worked with black pupils still faced risk, yet they no longer saw the tall figure with the battered hat and the shotgun stepping into their path on the road. Farmers who had spoken against him could work their fields without scanning every tree line for his familiar horse. Violence did not end with him. Other former guerrillas and outlaws continued to attack freedmen, unionists, and officials in Texas and Arkansas for years. Some of Baker's old associates carried on in their own ways until soldiers, sheriffs, or rival gunmen caught up with them. Reconstruction in the region remained bitter, contested, and marked with graves from both sides. However, the specific pattern of killings that had followed his movements, from ferry crossings to ambushes of officers, broke when he fell by the Foster chimney. In the early 1870s, the memory of his acts still shaped arguments in cabins and courthouses. Men who had once praised him learned to keep those words quieter when they spoke in public. Freedmen who had lived through his years of terror told children and grandchildren the names of the roads, ferries, and farms where he had spilled blood, using those stories as warnings about what could happen when men like him were allowed to rule by fear. Law officers and local officials who came afterward looked back to his case as an example of what happened when a killer was allowed to operate for years without firm intervention. The foster home and the ground where he died eventually saw ordinary tasks again. Children played near the yard where guns had roared. Crops grew in fields once shadowed by his rides, and a barn later marked the area near which his life ended. In Jefferson, visitors walking through Oakwood Cemetery came across his stone and read the simple carved letters without always knowing the full weight carried by the name beneath their feet. For the region that had known him directly, the grave did not close the record. The true measure of his life remained in the long line of victims stretching from the first man killed in a saloon quarrel to the freedmen shot on roads and the federal officers cut down in ambushes. All of them part of the trail that ended on that January morning in 1869, when neighbors decided that Cullen Montgomery Baker would not ride the sulphur country again.